Hello and welcome back, guys. Glad to see you around. Coffee link in the description. Make yourselves comfortable and enjoy. This is Book of the Dead, Chapter 116. Against the jostling crowd, Tyron stood firm as he gazed upward, a pocket of stillness amidst the flowing current of people. He ignored them and they ignored him, which was often the way of it in Kenmore, he'd come to learn. Towering 30 meters tall in front of him, the faces of his mother and father looked down, stern yet kind. He had to give it to the sculptors the Baron had commissioned from the central province. They'd done well to capture the likeness of the famous pair, even going so far as to rename Kenmore Square, the beating heart of the city, in tribute to the fallen, beloved heroes. Such a tragic story, taking their own lives after ending the shame of their murderous son, sacrificing themselves to remove the stain on their good name. The sheer arrogance of it twisted in his guts like poison. He wanted to scream in rage, to lash out at the misty-eyed passers-by, gazing up at the mighty statues with wistful expressions. He wanted to kick and punch and stab until the city itself was reduced to a crumbling ruin. But he did none of those things. A slight smile curled the corner of his lips as he turned away. Letting out his anger wouldn't bring this city down, so he sealed it away. Just wait, Kenmore. I have so many things in mind for you. The bell rang overhead as Tyron stepped through the door and into his shop. Master Armsfield, welcome, beamed Seri from behind the counter. He gave her a short nod. Miss Tiln, how is the store this morning? The brown-haired girl gave him a vigorous thumbs up. Everything's flawless. Business is booming, as always. Rather, I'm shocked at how many people have been coming through lately. Tyron grunted. A recommendation from the most well-known enchanter in the city will do that. Master Willem was quite glowing in his praise. How's our stock? We are starting to run a little low on a few items. The water purification wheel has been a hit. I want to see a full inventory at the end of the day. I'll see if I can replenish our wares overnight. Where's Flynn? He's upstairs, Master Armsfield. Thank you. I'll leave you to it then. With a nod to the girl, he stepped behind the counter, ignored the questioning looks from the dozen or so customers browsing the glass display cases throughout the shop floor, and entered the back rooms. Once he was upstairs, he knocked twice on the workshop door, before he pushed the door open and found his apprentice face down on the table, snoring loudly. This idiot, he frowned, judging by the cores scattered across his table, and the pliance he still gripped in his hand. The man had fallen asleep working at his station again. He stepped up behind the dozing apprentice and shook his shoulder. I'm awake, Flynn gasped, flailing his arms. Blood and bone, settle down. Tyron scowled. You fell asleep at your station again. Were you working all night? Ah, Master Armsfield, good to see you. Why, yes, I was. I hope I didn't disturb you. He hadn't, since Tyron hadn't been resting in his bedroom in the room next to this one, but down in the basement performing work of a different kind. If you're having trouble meeting your quotas, then tell me. You won't be fired for failing to meet deliveries I've set too high, but you will be fired if you waste materials and send 40 enchantments downstairs to be sold. The young man cringed away from his master, and Tyron struggled to remind himself that he'd hired the apprentice himself after an extended screening process. Flynn Rivner was a skilled arcanist with quick hands, a knack for the art, and insufficient backing to get himself into a better apprenticeship. Tyron himself had only gotten into Wilhelm's by expending a sizable chunk of the wealth his parents had left for him. Seeing Flynn's dazed and slightly fearful expression, the necromancer forced down a flash of anger. We're almost the same age, Flynn. Have a little pride, man. Go home, get some rest, he said finally, pinching the bridge of his nose. I don't want to see you in the store until tomorrow morning. There is to be no more working overnight. We will work out the pace at which you produce your best work, and we will stick to that. Have I made myself clear? You have, Master Armsfield. With the hangdog expression of a beaten puppy, Flynn staggered from his workstation and downstairs. Not a moment too soon, as Tyron had almost succumbed to the irrational urge to put his foot up the young man's backside. What is wrong with that boy? He wondered out loud, then snorted when he realized how he sounded. After running through his apprenticeship in record time and setting up his own business, Tyron had leaped past many of his contemporaries in the industry. In fact, many who were significantly older than he was were still toiling away doing bit work in other people's shops. It was hard to remember, sometimes, that he was only 22. With a critical eye, he looked over his workshop, making sure his components, tools, and materials were in their proper places. His hands twitched, wanting to be busy, but he took a moment to calm himself. The visit to the square had unsettled him, rattled his mentality, and upset his emotions. The last thing Tyron could afford was to throw away everything he'd built over the last 4 years, just as it was coming to fruition. The foundations of his vengeance had finally been laid. Impatience and a lack of control would destroy everything in an instant. After several long, steadying breaths, the young mage took hold of himself, stepping out of the workshop and locking it behind him. He descended the steps, but rather than turning left and entering the shop floor, he turned right into a storeroom. With solid strides, he navigated his way past the various crates, sealed pots, and other containers of supplies needed for his trade, until he stopped facing a shelf laden with jars and texts. Carefully, he removed a vessel filled with a syrupy green mixture, then reached out with his arcane senses, searching for his own handiwork. When he found it, he gestured once, twice, thrice in the air before snapping his hands back to his side. An almost inaudible click reached his ear, and he grasped the side of the shelf and pulled. Despite its size and weight, it swung easily, revealing a staircase leading down into the dark. Tyron stepped through, carefully swung the shelf closed behind him, before he conjured a ball of light and made his way into the basement. Even then, he had to open 2 more doors, similarly locked with enchanted sigils, and only when that was done, did he finally step inside his private study. Tyron insisted on thinking of it as a study, rather than a lair, or laboratory, or anything with such childishly sinister overtones. In his mind, this was a place of learning, a place for him to experiment and develop his skills. Therefore, a study. 20 corpses in various states of dismemberment still lay on the stone slabs placed evenly along one wall. With a practiced eye, the necromancer checked the various enchanted arrays he had placed around the room to ensure they were functional. Sound dampeners, for obvious reasons. Heat exchangers to keep the temperature down, again for obvious reasons, along with a few magic gathering arrays on his desk for powering or charging anything he was working on. Despite doing most of the work himself, Tyron was pleased with the results. When he thought back to the times he'd been scribbling in his notebook in caves or on the back of a moving cart, his current arrangements seemed sinfully luxurious. It hadn't been easy to get to this point. He'd had to cash in several of the favors his mother and father had earned for him, as well as dip extremely deep into the finances he'd inherited. But now everything was in place. He could finally return to improving his abilities as a necromancer, and there was so much work to do. "All right, let's get organized," he said aloud as he sat at his desk and pulled his tattered old notebook open. As an apprentice arcanist, Tyron hadn't allowed himself to even think of necromancy, let alone commit notes to paper. Living and working around so many people, with essentially no privacy, it would have been insane to take the risk. Thus, his notes remained preserved from the last time he'd worked on them, on the barrier mountains near the rift. Of course, Tyron had performed the status ritual dozens of times since then, as he'd steadily improved his new subclass. But Undead Weaver remained at 36, where he had left it, and I have to leave it there for a while longer yet. Before I can upgrade my class at level 40, I need to reach my skill goals. Death magic, raise dead, corpse appraisal, corpse preparation, bone threading. At the bare minimum, each of these needs to reach their maximum level before I can even consider reaching level 40, which meant he needed to conduct experiments and go through a huge amount of repetition without actually raising any undead or fighting with them. Once he'd succeeded and upgraded his class, though, then he would be fully off the leash. Tyron wasn't so naive as to think a level 40 necromancer could be strong enough to bring down the magisters, the nobles, or especially the gods. He needed time and resources to lay the perfect foundation for his advancement, and then he would sprint toward level 60, or 80, or however high he needed to go, until he felt confident enough to achieve his aims. There was a huge amount of testing and experimentation to do with his newfound enchanting skills also. He'd chosen this profession carefully, as he saw possibilities to solve many of his problems as a necromancer with it. He already knew it was possible for undead to share magic with each other, and the more that were bound before being risen, the greater this amount was. This could help with the drain a high number of minions placed on his magic, but not solve the issue. After years of finicky, mind-numbing work, He had finally perfected the array he'd been working on as Master Willem's apprentice. He was confident it could gather magic, and then channel it into an undead as needed, without his active involvement at all. Again, it wouldn't solve the issue, but if he could cut the cost of each minion down by even 10%, that would mean for every 10 minions he raised, he could have another for free. And perhaps, with a little luck, persistence, and finger-breaking work, he might achieve an even better result. A 20% reduction in magic cost would be very beneficial. As his thoughts drifted to the possibilities, Tyron shook himself back to focus. There was no point chasing every rabbit down into the warren. He had to tackle one problem at a time. First, corpse appraisal and preparation, the foundational skills of his profession. He needed to develop and master new ways to examine the raw materials used to create undead, and then ready them to be raised. He stood up and pulled down his butcher's tools from where they hung on the wall. Chapter 117. Tyron pulled his cloak a little tighter around himself. A chill wind blew down the cobbled roads of Kenmore, the tall buildings providing less shelter than one thought they would. Perhaps these large stone edifices were responsible for conjuring the city's infamous breezes. He didn't know, but traveling inside the walls at night was always particularly cold, even in the summer months. The western road was filled with traffic even at this late hour. 30 meters wide, the thoroughfare cut through the city like a knife, dividing the northern and southern sides. The one and only safe passage into the central province. It was the main artery of the city, and one could argue, all of the east. Crossing it was always a chore, but at the newly renamed Steelham Square, it wasn't quite as difficult. The wide open square provided enough room for the carts and wagons to spread out, allowing foot traffic to pass through a little more easily. Since he'd entered the walls from the dock gate after negotiating deliveries at the Silvership warehouse, this was the obvious choice to cross. Ho, watch it, idiot. Sorry. Tyron raised a hand in apology to a wagon driver as he stepped around a temperamental horse that flared its nostrils when he stepped too close. The mage slowed his step and moved more cautiously until he was through the worst of it. He'd been rushing, as he tended to do when heading to this part of the city. The sooner this trip was over, the better. It wasn't as if he didn't have better things to do. A backlog of orders at the shop needed to be seen to, before it began to cause problems. After spending his nights in the basement experimenting on corpses, his enchanting work had naturally suffered. Progress in necromancy was important, but he couldn't afford to let his cover slip. 2 more sleepless nights should allow him to catch up, so long as the cores were delivered on time tomorrow, which would push him to almost a week without sleep. As much as he hated to lose the time, he'd need a good night of rest before resuming his nocturnal studies. With his superhuman constitution and mental fortitude, he could go a long time without sleep, but pushing too far would begin to affect his spellwork. Once he reached the northern side of Kenmore, his mouth twisted into a half snarl without him realizing it. The houses were larger, 4 or 5 stories, and expensively apportioned. Despite the population still being dense, the opulence only grew more decadent the further north he went. To his right, the Magister's tower loomed, and his fists clenched every time he glimpsed it from the corner of his eye. Beyond that, the noble quarter and the Dawn Fortress, home of the Baron, could still be seen outlined against the night sky, separated from the masses by a tall dividing wall, of course. Further north, the Gold District, another walled area of the city, but for a rather different reason. Home to the powerful slayers who had crossed the level 60 threshold before retiring, the Gold District was a gilded cage for the strongest warriors and most powerful mages in the province. He wasn't headed there, though. He was headed to Vale Street, immediately adjacent to the Slayers' retirement home. Paper board guard drawled as Tyron approached. Lucas Armsfield, here on business. Tyron smiled easily as he handed his papers over. Uh-huh. That's what they all say, the man snorted as he leaned casually against his post, eyes flicking over the page. Only bronze. Can you afford it in there? Tyron's smile tightened. I'm not a slayer, I'm an arcanist. Oh, shit. Forget I said anything, you definitely can. It's criminal how much you lot charge for the most basic shit. How hard can it be to heat a fucking toilet seat? Why don't you try it then, idiot? He continued to smile. After a final glance, the guard handed back the papers, which Tyron stowed carefully away, before he turned and opened the gate. Welcome to Vale Street. Don't mess with the golds. If they rip your face off, we won't be doing much about it. I appreciate the warning. After he stepped through the gate, Tyron repeated the process at the second checkpoint, 10 meters down the road, before he was actually able to step foot on Vale Street. The moment he did so, he was enveloped by soft red light that emanated from the enchanted globes that hung from poles and storefronts down the length of the street. At this late hour, the street thronged with people, laughing raucously, drinking and generally staggering about, enjoying all the delights of this hedonistic paradise. Tyron hated it. Much as he had when crossing the Western Road, he moved cautiously through the crowd, being careful not to bump anyone or get in the way. You never knew if the man or woman you accidentally tripped was actually over level 60, and might cave your chest in with one drunken punch. Scantily clad men and women moved through the people with the grace of dancers, mysterious smiles on their faces and laughter in their eyes as they serviced the crowds. Several spoke to him as he moved past, inviting him inside for a drink or something more, but he politely declined each time. Eventually, he reached his destination, a massive, 5-story edifice painted entirely red. Somehow, the building managed to pull off the color without looking gaudy. The contours of the walls, the tiered roof and tastefully suggestive carvings transformed the structure into a beguiling temple with just a whiff of danger about it. Unlike most places of business on the street, there were no tables or service in front of the building, only 6 heavily armed guards in full armor, flanking a massive double door. Held open, a steady stream of people moved in and out, along with a dark smoke that trickled through the top of the opening. With a mixture of irritation and reluctance, Tyron squared his shoulders and moved to the door, sliding through the opening when an opportunity arrived. The second he was inside, the scent of cloying smoke filled his nose and clung to his throat. The corridor was dark, lit from below, with dim red lights projected from cores set at the joint of the wall and floor. From rooms branching to either side, he glimpsed people luxuriating in lush furniture, draped over each other as they sipped from delicate glasses or gleaming metallic goblets. As elsewhere on the street, there was laughter and boisterous enjoyment. But it was different in this building. The laughter was muted, but the indulgence more intense. A feverish need gripped these people so palpably Tyron could almost feel it on his skin. He avoided being entangled by beguiling servers dressed in form-hugging black clothing, and made his way to the staircase. On the second floor, the smoke was even thicker, the lighting even darker, the people even more frantic. Without pausing, he pushed through into a lavish room, the walls covered in padded red leather, and cast his eyes across the dozens of impossibly handsome men and women waiting on the edge of the room. When he found the one he wanted, his eyes narrowed and he approached with heavy steps. A young man eyed his approach, eyes widening with recognition and a sly smile on his face. Dressed in a vest and pants that left nothing to the imagination, with an ornate, carved black skull positioned over his crotch, he leaned back, putting his well-formed physique on display as Tyron drew closer. "You, in the back," now Tyron growled. "Why, Mr. Armsfield?" The young man smiled coyly. "Aren't you forceful today? Allow me to lead the way." He reached out to take Tyron by the hand, but the mage slapped him away with a glare. With a hurt expression on his face and an excited gleam to his eyes, he sashayed through an open doorway, and Tyron followed. Rooms on the left and right were barred with heavy, wooden doors, soft, muted sounds of passion drifting through. The pair walked past them both, until they came to an unadorned door that the young man opened before bowing, gesturing for Tyron to enter. Within the room was a plain wooden table with 4 chairs, modestly lit from an ordinary globe that hung from the middle of the roof. With a sigh, Tyron reached into his mouth and removed the filtration device he'd put in before entering. It was uncomfortable, but better than inhaling that damn smoke. He placed it on the table before he sat, adjusting his cloak and resting his hands on his lap. "Put him on the table and fuck off," he said tersely. The young man pouted. "Mr. Armsfield," he said, his voice coy, "the mistress has given her instructions, and you know that I must obey her wishes." Tyron glared at him. "I warned you last time. If your mistress has something to say, she can say it to me directly." "Why, Mr. Armsfield, you put me in a very uncomfortable position." Yet he sounded as if he quite enjoyed it. The mage's hands rose, and before the teasing expression on the escort's face could change, they flickered rapidly through a sequence of sigils. The necromancer's mind crashed into the other like a smith's hammer on a pinnacone. He tightened his grip cruelly. "Put him on the table." As if in a dream, the young man detached the carved skull from his belt and placed it on the table, his eyes glazed over. Now cut yourself, Tyron whispered, drawing a jagged line down his own face. Right here. Deep. Do it now. The young man nodded, drool beginning to leak from the corner of his mouth, before he turned and left the room. Shit, forgot to tell him to close the door, Tyron cursed as he rose and did it himself. He sat back down and looked at the carved onyx skull, with a mix of pity and exasperation. After all the pain and sacrifice, that this was the outcome still angered him to his core. Though if there were one individual to blame, I told you not to piss her off. Really? Really? Are you going to open with that every time, you fucking prick? How about, hello, Dove, how have you been? Huh? Would that break your balls? A little bit of polite chatter to open the conversation. That's how normal people do it. Normal people aren't talking to the enslaved soul of their friend who wouldn't stop pissing off a vampire. I didn't think she was this mad about it. Do you have any idea how much cock I've seen in the last year? A lot. It's fine if that's your scene, obviously. But I've never swung this way, Tyron. Now they're swinging all over me. Day and night, it never fucking stops. It's a brothel. Of course it never stops. Thanks for the words of wisdom. Are you any closer to getting me out of here or what? I do not want to be used to cup any more balls. I'm working on it. Work faster. I'm doing what I can. It isn't easy. I'm not exactly her boss. In necromantic terms, she captured your soul fair and square. I wouldn't have even been there if you hadn't locked me in my own skull to start with. I know. All right. I'm trying to get you free. It's just taking time. The two fell into uncomfortable silence for a long moment. Is she even coming? Give her a second, Tyron sighed. Sure enough, several seconds later, they heard someone stomping down the corridor toward the room. How does she do that in heels? Dove wondered. How do you know she's in heels? She's always in heels. Please tell me you aren't still staring at her feet all the time. A man needs a hobby. I'm never freeing you, am I? The door crashed open to reveal Yor in her icy majesty. Her black satin dress managed to cover everything, yet still reveal it all at the same time. Snow-white skin, raven black hair and burning red eyes, she hadn't aged a day in the last 4 years, appearing exactly as she had the day Tyron had met her, albeit much better dressed. Civilization agreed with the vampire. She'd been significantly happier in the capital than in the woods. Right now, she looked anything but happy. Again, Tyron. She glared daggers at him. Who's Tyron? I'm respected businessman, Lucas Armsfield. Oh, shut up, she snapped before she stormed into the room, slamming the door shut behind her. You dare to mark another of my toys? The necromancer glared back. I warned you. Treat Dove with some respect, or I'll do worse to your slave next time. I know you can fix the cut with no scarring. If he gelds himself, I wonder how well that can be repaired with your blood magic. I will do what I want with that pervert, until he has paid for his actions. Don't push it, Yor, or I'll pick him up and walk out with him tonight. Do you want to test your mistress's patience that far? Be silent, Yor growled, animalistic fury igniting in her eyes. Tyron felt her influence try to seize hold of his thoughts. He stiffened in his chair and grit his teeth as he fought her off. You didn't, he roared as he stood, slamming his hands down. The two glared at each other across the table. Mummy, Daddy, stop fighting, Dove said plaintively. Or do with less clothes on. Angry sex is fucking hot. Silence hung in the room for a moment before Tyron clapped a hand to his face. You idiot, he muttered before he laughed. Why do I even bother? He sat down and gestured for Yor to do the same. The vampire complied, her anger dissipating a little, though she glared daggers at the skull on the table. I still don't understand the whole brothel thing. I thought vampires couldn't even have sex. Tyron shook his head. A slight smile curved Yor's ruby red lips. Sex is a weapon. Even better, it's a weapon that can't be used against us. Besides, in places like this, where memories are blurred and inhibitions are low, people are easily parted from their blood. My coven is drowning in it this past year. She practically shivered as she said it, and Tyron twisted in his seat uncomfortably. Just don't go overboard. It hasn't been easy getting you established. She arched a brow at him. Are you saying your investment has gone poorly? Anything but. He made almost as much money from the Red Pavilion as he did his own store. Tyron was quickly running out of things to spend his wealth on. I mean, you have greater ambitions than a brothel in a well-heeled part of town. If people start turning up dead, or undead, then your project is going to be burned out before it really gets off the ground. The vampire leaned back and pursed her lips. A distracting sight. You aren't wrong and we are being careful. I'm maintaining a tight grip on my people. Very tight. That isn't what you should be worried about. Tyron rolled his eyes. What is it this time? More planning permits. Identities need to be mocked up. I've been jumping through so many administrative hoops I feel like an acrobat. For once, you're hesitated. Not so much. This time, it's politics. She said the word with gentle distaste. You have agreed to help the court, and we appreciate your ongoing assistance. But you must recall our previous discussion about factions. He did. Vampires, as it turned out, bickered and squabbled between each other even more than non-immortals. To be fair, they had a lot of time on their hands and cared a great deal about hierarchy. In fact, they cared about nothing quite so much as hierarchy, if his understanding was correct. That's all your side. Tyron waved a hand to dismiss the issue. I don't want to get involved. You and your mistress have my help establishing a presence in this realm. That was the agreement. If other vampires have an issue, then you need to deal with it. Yours smile revealed a little more fang than usual. Oh, we have been dealing with issues. The problem will be when our rivals reach out to you directly. This realm, this empire, is ripe for our influence, like a fresh, unplucked fruit. So many potential servants, so much blood. The more others sniff around, the more they will want a slice. And you're blocking them, which means they'll try to go around you and come straight to me. She nodded. Not all of us are quite as socially minded as my mistress. Others prefer a more direct approach. You will find their entreaties to be difficult to resist. So the answer is, stay hidden. If they don't find you, they will need to work with other, inferior intermediaries, people we can safely cut off. Thanks to agreements secured by his parents, Tyron was a little more protected and not so easily disposed of. Without that, Yor and her mistress might have erased him already. Now that they were established, the coven was growing in wealth and cultivating influence at an obscene rate. Tyron leaned forward and rubbed at his temples. Sometimes, I think this alliance is more trouble than it's worth, he groaned. You've only begun to scratch the surface of what the court can do for you, your purd. We are moving forward with procuring certain knowledge for your use as an example. The necromancer perked up immediately. That's great news, he said eagerly, eyes gleaming. Are you guys going to fuck or what? Dove demanded. Chapter 118. Seriton said goodbye to her mother as she stepped out the door into the bustle of Shade Town, the door closing with the ringing of a bell behind her. It was dark this early, as it always was in the shadow of the wall. They wouldn't get direct sunlight for another hour. But even so, she felt invigorated by the dawn shade. She giggled at the thought as she stepped off the doorstep and onto the narrow road, already filled with people going about their day. Farmers were bringing crops and produce in from the fields, stocking their stalls of supplying businesses preparing for a day's trading. Market Square was the center of trade outside the wall, and she'd been lucky to be born in the prosperous area. Mornin', Seri, her neighbor, Lila, called as she stepped from her house. Off to the store. The younger girl nodded happily. That's right. It's been so busy over there, Lila, you have no idea. The florist chuckled as she pulled her shawl around her shoulders, falling into step behind her young friend. I'm not surprised. I can't ever remember an arcanist opening a business outside the wall. Normally, you find them closer to the castle, not out here with the rest of us. Seri sniffed. That's because they charge way too much. Master Armsfield is different, his prices are much more reasonable. Well, whatever the reason, I'm grateful for it. I got a heating pan for my bed last week, and my old bones have never felt so spry in the morning. My hip barely aches anymore. It was pleasing to hear the wonderful things her employer had been able to do for the people of Shaytown. From glow lights, to heating pans, to filters and dozens of other knickknacks. The more well-to-do citizens of Kenmore took for granted, the products had been flying off the shelves. Seri grinned. I hear so many stories just like that, she said. People come in all the time to tell me how wonderful it's been. Most of them have never owned anything enchanted in their lives. She leaned forward conspiratorially. My father came to the shop and bought a temperature-controlling array and installed it in the kitchen for Mother. She's been singing his praises for the last week, since it always gets so stuffy in there. She knew he'd done it because he was too cheap to pay for the renovations necessary to achieve proper ventilation. But her mother had been happy either way. She baked for a living, and with so many ovens going at once, it was like a furnace in there most days. Now, at least the corner she did most of her preparations and decorating in was pleasantly cool the whole day around. I told him to fork over and purchase heating plates for the ovens, but he's still leery. She snorted, affronted that Master Umsfield's work could be doubted, and Lila laughed. Well, I'm sure he'll come around. I'm not likely to get time to come into the store, but do pass on my thanks to Mr. Umsfield for me, would you? I will when I see him, Sari shrugged. The owner kept strange hours, sometimes working upstairs all day, sometimes sleeping all day and working all night, and sometimes just straight up vanishing for days at a time. On the one hand, it was odd, on the other, it was pleasing to know how much she was trusted. This is me, Sari. You have a good day now. Lila patted her on the shoulder before turning down a narrow road. You too. Another 2 streets down and she arrived at the market proper, crowded already, hawkers calling to the crowd, advertising their wares. It was a familiar sound that felt like nothing so much as home. Around the corner, onto Office Street, and she was standing in front of the shop. She rummaged through her bag for a moment before she found the tightly bound key Master Umsfield had made for her. She waved it in front of the handle, and after a moment, there was a slight click as the door unlocked. It was difficult to restrain a small laugh, as it was every morning. Something so ordinary, like unlocking a door, had become ever so slightly magical, and she loved it. Stepping inside, the store was immaculate as always, gleaming display cases, polished hardwood floors with curved trimmings and finishes. However much it had cost to set up the store, it must have been a small fortune. Half the time, she was afraid of slipping and damaging something she couldn't afford to replace. She closed the door gently behind her and began her normal morning routine. Cleaning the floor came first, then the benches and tables, before she moved onto the glass. It was hard to avoid the sad reality staring back at her from those tassel cushions. However, they were running dangerously low on stock. Many of the displays were empty, almost half of them in fact. The store had been extremely successful since it opened, but perhaps Master Umsfield needed to hire more workers. Apprentice Rivner worked hard, his handsome face pinched with worry and concentration whenever he was in the store, but perhaps just one apprentice wasn't enough. She wondered about that as she cleaned the windows in the front of the store. Did they need to expand already? There was probably room upstairs for more apprentices to work. Lost in thought, she ran through her chores until the doorbell rang, and she turned with a squeak, caught by surprise. Flynn Rivner stopped and stared at her, a slight blush on his face. Oh, sorry, Sari. I didn't mean to scare you. She felt furious at herself for looking so foolish in front of him. It's nothing, Apprentice Rivner, she smiled, trying to regain her poise. How are you this morning? I mean, morning. Control your tongue, Sari. You want him to think you're some country bumpkin. I'm fine, he said, shuffling his feet a little before he realized he was still in the doorway. I should head upstairs then. Nice to see you, Miss Tiln. Nice to see you as well, Apprentice Rivner. Her eyes trailed after him as he strode across the shop floor and towards the steps, without trying to make it obvious. He was just so tall and dignified. She sighed. He must have all sorts of fancy women inside the wall chasing after him. A promising arcanist apprentice with his whole life ahead of him had a lot of prospects. She returned to work only to turn back when she heard Flynn coming back down the stairs, a rueful expression on his face. She glanced down and saw the elaborate case used to hold the finished cores in his hands. Oh, has Master Umsfield been working last night? It appears so, Apprentice Rivner sighed before he placed the case carefully down on the counter, and shook his head. There was something about the look in his eye that prompted her to ask, is something wrong? We certainly needed the work done. Half the store is sold out. She gestured toward the cases. Sorry. Oh, it's nothing. I'm just shocked is all. Sari was confused. About what? Apprentice Rivner went to speak a few times before he finally settled on what to say. He's just too fast, he said finally with a sigh, gesturing at the case. I had a look, there's 100 cores in here, easily. And I've studied the master's work carefully, it's flawless. He looked a little despondent as he spoke, which only confused the girl further. Wasn't that a good thing? Is that a problem? She asked. The arcanist in training chuckled a little and blessed her with his shy smile, causing her heart to skip a beat. No, it's not a problem. I just don't know how he does it. I've tried to keep up to his pace, but I fail 2 out of 3 times if I work that quick. You're a wonderful apprentice, Seri said firmly. Master Umsfield said so himself on several occasions. Don't worry, soon you'll be able to catch up. You're still an apprentice, after all. I'm only 2 years younger than he is. That doesn't matter at all. Not everyone completed their apprenticeship as quickly. Nobody completes their apprenticeship that quickly. It caused quite a stir. That's why I applied to work here, you know. I wanted to learn from someone that extraordinary. Well, now you have your chance, she encouraged him. Don't be downhearted because it's hard. It was always going to be hard. He nodded thoughtfully. You're right. If I'd wanted an easy apprenticeship, I would have stayed where I was. Thank you, Seri. Not a problem, Apprentice Rivner. Please, call me Flynn. She blushed. Of course, Flynn. They gazed at each other for a moment until a loud thump accompanied by muffled cursing rang out from upstairs. I should go and get these set, Flynn said quickly, grabbing the tray and heading to the back room. I should finish cleaning. Seri darted back to her chores. The store would be open shortly, and she had a lot to do. There was something soothing, something meditative about the work of an arcanist. Taking the cores, the condensed power of magic itself, and rewriting it, one line at a time, was a mysterious and powerful art. The process itself, however, was tedious, finicky, and required an inordinate amount of fine motor control, along with a level of focus that bordered on impossible. In other words, it suited Tyron down to the ground. Crafting classes required an absurd amount of grind in order to level day after day of relentless, grueling repetition. Couple that with the necessity of experimentation to break through any bottlenecks that arose. And it was well known how notoriously difficult it was to become a master craftsman. This went doubly so for those with a crafting subclass. As an arcanist, Tyron was limited to only 40 levels and 1 class advancement. That meant 8 feats in total, and a limit to the number of skills and abilities he could purchase. This meant he could never truly equal a master of the craft. Someone like Master Willem was in a stratosphere he could never reach, able to take the most powerful cores and transform them into enchantments only gold-ranked slayers, or the nobility, could afford. That level of control and finesse, he could never possess it. But he didn't need to. Instead, he had aimed every new ability, every new feat in an entirely different direction. He wanted to squeeze every drop of power from the simplest and smallest of cores. Efficiency, efficacy, with not even a wisp of lost magic. Tyron leaned back from the glass with a tired sigh before he rolled his shoulders and cracked his neck. No matter how he tried to sit straight, he always ended up with a slight hunch as he worked, leaning over to bring his face to the glass and see even a little better. Another one done, only 100 or so to go. It sounded like a lot, but his pace was good, completing each core in roughly 2 minutes. An absurd pace for the work, and the key reason behind the success of Umsfield enchantments. Arcanist's work was useful for a lot of things. Heating, cooling, cleansing, healing, lighting, basically every aspect of daily living. Of course, most in the trade focused their attention on where the big money lay, weapons and armor for slayers. Fighting was a constant part of life in the provinces, even if it happened out of sight for most people. At the rifts, the slayers made the bulk of their money from selling Rift King components and cores, and they turned around and spent that money on improving their gear, or on alchemical potions or other supplies. Some held exclusive contracts where they traded the best and rarest cores directly to famous arcanists, in exchange for preferential treatment or discounts. The constant demand for new and better enchanted weapons and armor, as well as the churn caused by lost gear within the rifts, meant that the majority of cores harvested went to this cause. That meant enchantments for daily life were expensive and rare. Rare unless you could produce the same effect using smaller, more easily obtainable cores. Tyron could make a heating plate almost 70% as effective as what the best arcanists in Kenmore could make, except his were a tenth of the price, formed from a hyper-efficient network of the lowest grade cores. Naturally, This meant he was essentially alone in targeting this particular market, poorer folks outside the walls, who never dreamed of owning such luxuries. In the end, this was an unintended benefit to his true aim. All along, Tyron had focused on maximizing the power he could gain from weaker cores, because that was all he could afford to use in his undead. No matter how wealthy he became, it would be too ridiculous to engrave and set a high-grade core within a simple skeleton. His current business model came to be after he thought long and hard on how he could maximize the benefits of enchanting for his minions, and be successful enough to provide cover for his other endeavors. Diligently, and with absolute focus, he continued to etch the runes with his pliants, placing each completed core into the case with the others, before he checked the order sheet, picked up another core, and began the process again. 3.5 hours later, he was done. He stood with a groan and stretched, feeling his back pop. Muttering about old age, he shook out his hands, grabbed the case of finished cores, and walked downstairs. It wasn't too busy in the store, given it was roughly lunchtime, only 5 people wandering amongst the display cases, and reading the engraved descriptions of the wares. As always, Seri was a bright and cheery presence, moving from cleaning the shop to answering questions, to ringing up sales with ease and grace. He shook his head. The girl hadn't even had her awakening yet. If she gained some sort of service class, he'd triple her salary to keep her on. A warm smile greeted him as she saw him wander onto the shop floor. Master Armsfield, nice to see your face today. At the mention of his name, several customers turned to catch a glimpse of him, but he ignored them. Seri nattered on. I have to tell you, my friend Lila. He nodded along as he walked, entering the back room where he found his apprentice hard at work setting the cores into the various wares that they sold. It was a delicate process, but by far the straightforward part of the job. A core inscribed to create flame down the length of a blade was particularly useless, until it was set into a blade. After all, the back room was filled with the various plates, wheels, dials and other pieces they sold. All of it was ordered from local craftsmen in Shaytown. Tyron set the case down on a bench to the side. Here's another lot. I need these set today, if possible, Flynn. He hesitated before he turned away. But don't push yourself too much. Whatever you can get done by closing is fine. Finish up the rest tomorrow. The younger man looked at the case with an odd, queasy expression, which Tyron ignored. Are you two alright closing up? I'm going to sleep. Now he turned and stomped back upstairs, throwing off his clothes and collapsing into bed. When he woke, he could check on his experiments. He greatly anticipated the results. Chapter 119. Rage gripped him. Tyron's fingers curled into fists as the breath whistled between his clenched teeth. Clear as the day it happened. He could see Magnan and Beery on the ground before him, eyes closed, faces at peace. The knife still stuck in his father's chest. Muscles knotted in his forearms and shoulders as he struggled to release the tension. The more he fought against it, the more it gripped him. He felt possessed, trapped inside his own body as grief and anger took control. Conscious thought was relegated to a dim and forgotten corner of his mind. Somewhere in this city, the magisters who had tortured his parents lived, secure in their authority, safe within their tower. Behind them, the nobles, touched by the gods themselves, with the divine right to rule, locked behind a literal wall he could not cross. He hated them. He hated all of them. They had to die. The black rage that possessed him would allow nothing less. But it couldn't be now. He wasn't ready. He needed time. Gradually, millimeter by millimeter, he unclenched his jaw. One by one, he eased the tension in his fingers. The necromancer sucked in a deep breath, held it, then released it slowly, before he repeated the process. For 10 minutes, he calmed himself, unwinding the knots in his body and heart, until he was calm and in control again. In time, he promised himself, walk the narrow path, take your time, and you will succeed in the end. Only when he was certain he was in control of himself did Tyron swing his feet off the bed, and begin to prepare himself for the day. The sun had not yet begun to rise, so the world remained dark as he changed, moving through his austere and organized chamber. These episodes are coming more frequently. I may need to do something before it becomes a problem. For those long years as an apprentice, living in a dorm alongside his fellow struggling students, Tyron had wedged his feelings so deep inside that there had been no hope of them emerging. To all intents and purposes, he had become Lucas Armsfield, never allowing himself even a second of respite from the relentless act. It may well have driven him mad if he hadn't spent his every waking moment on the study and practice of enchanting. Now though, now that he had his own space, now that he had begun to work as a necromancer again, his anger had begun to break free from the prison he had used to contain it. The grief he had felt that day burned in him still, raw and abraded, like an open wound. Sometimes, he awoke at night, a roar of pure hatred struggling to burst out of his throat. As he walked in the city, he felt an irrational urge to strike at those around him, to take out his pain on them, the innocent citizens of Kenmore. It was a problem that needed a solution. He needed an outlet, lest these fits jeopardize his task. Perhaps when I return to hunting Rivkin, that will suffice. It would be some time before he was able to enact that particular plan. However, after he washed his face in the basin and slicked back his hair, Tyron carefully applied the glamour, crafting it with a skill and dexterity he could only have dreamed of when roaming the plains in the back of that stupid cart. Even though it was night and nobody would enter the store for hours, there was never any need to take a risk. As long as he was outside of his chamber, he would appear as Lucas Umsfield. Preparations complete, he trod quietly down the stairs, and made his way through the secret entrance to the basement. Time to check on his experiments. The 20 bodies he had received in his first shipment had been stripped of their flesh long ago. After considering what to do with the remains, he'd ended up dumping them in the sewer, far from the store. Hopefully, the rats and other nasties that flourished down there had finished the grisly work for him. Afterwards, he'd finally been able to begin to develop and test new methods. The first thing he'd done had been to try and create an enchanted lens he could use to scry magic, and specifically, death magic. The lens sat on his bench now, a moderate success. It had enabled him to see death magic when looking through it. Sure enough, but hadn't been able to detect the minute amounts contained within the bones. A fully working model would let him examine the formation and movement of energy within the remains, at the finest level of detail. Many nights of complex work lay ahead of him before he could achieve that, so he'd begun sketching out his next version, before moving on to other projects. The first thing he needed to do was develop his corpse appraisal skill, which meant developing and adapting new methods to learn about the bones he was working with. So he'd focused on listing the information that was important for him to have, and then worked backwards, trying to determine the best way to achieve it. Stuck to the wall over his desk, a sheet of paper outlined his current paths of inquiry. Magic formation and movement. Develop lens. Density. Construct methodology. Unseen influence. Question mark. Link potential. Compatibility test. Related to magic formation. Tyron stepped from one set of bones to the next. Each was still a complete skeleton, laid out in place on its own slab around the outside of the basement. At 4 different locations on each skeleton sat a small tool, powered by only a single, low-grade core, one each on the left tibia, the 5th rib, the skull and the scapula. The bones in question had been chosen almost at random, but the device was a simple thing, basically 2 prongs, with a gap of 10 centimeters between them. On the tip of one prong was a short script that sent a pulse of magic at regular intervals, which was received by a detection script on the other. It was his own version of a similar technique used by engineers and builders to determine the grade and quality of stone. The longer the delay between the pulse being sent and received, the more dense the material between them. Diligently, he removed and checked each device before recording the results and storing them away. As he'd suspected, the density of the skeletons varied quite a bit. Some were significantly stronger than others. Whether more dense bones made better minions was something he wasn't sure of, but he suspected it would be the case. Perhaps the density is related to the amount of magic that can be stored in the bones. An unexpected thought. If so, then his density test could be used to determine the ideal concentration of death energy in the skeleton. Of course, it would take a huge amount of tests and quite a bit of maths to work it out, but he was up for the challenge. Naturally, the causes behind the differences between each skeleton were a mystery to him. Was it due to diet, the class of the person who had donated the remains, and therefore, the influence of the unseen, or some other reason entirely? Right now, he wasn't sure what might be important in the corpse appraisal process, so it was better for him to cast a wide net, and grasp as much information as possible, then later refine his methods to what was relevant. Which brought him to his next point. The unseen was able to change people's bodies, making them tougher, stronger, faster through the levels they gained throughout their lives. Someone like Magnin had barely been human, capable of feats of strength 10 regular people couldn't duplicate. So was there a way for Tyron to determine how much of the Unseen's energy, will, potential, had been invested in a particular set of remains? More importantly, was it possible for him to replicate the effect? If he could toughen up the bones himself using the same method the Unseen used to modify living human skeletons, then he could turn any skeleton into a peak product, as if it had been taken from a gold-ranked slayer. No point getting ahead of yourself. If you can't even detect it, then there's no chance you can replicate it. And that was the issue. He had no idea how he might go about measuring the Unseen. As far as he was aware, nobody had any idea what it was, how it worked, or even why it did what it did. The only clue he had to go on was that the Unseen had arrived in this realm, along with the magic that originated from the first rifts. If it used magic, then he could work with it. Of that, he was supremely confident. Now he moved back along the rows of skeletons, his eyes focused on his next experiment. Around each set of remains sat a rectangular metal band, covered in engraved script. A small array of cores sat at the feet of each set, powering the strip of silver. One of the things he'd come to learn, quite by accident, was that silver reacted to death magic, but only under certain conditions. As he moved from one skeleton to the next, he focused on the band. Here and there, he could see a faint blackening of the metal, as if it had begun to rot. It was difficult to quantify precisely, but he could roughly work out which skeletons had damaged the metal more than others. This was his attempt to determine if some skeletons were able to transmit more death energy than others. As it was clear that 2 of his skeletons had projected more death magic, as their own strips of metal were quite tarnished, as were those of the skeletons beside them, but only on the side closest to his 2 suspects. Interesting. He hadn't thought this particular experiment would bear fruit so quickly. This could be an enormous discovery. It wasn't clear what made these 2 skeletons the most prodigious movers of death energy. They weren't the most dense skeletons, nor did he believe they'd been the highest level. There must be some other quality of the remains that led to this result. He simply had no idea what it was. Excited, he rushed back to his desk and began furiously taking notes, rushing to put all of his thoughts on paper. Eventually, he put down his pen, clasped his hands and thought. Ultimately, it all came back to death magic, and how little he understood it. That particular flavor of the energy which suffused the realm was the cornerstone of the necromantic arts, and it would be the deciding factor in his success or failure. Whether or not he could maximize his abilities as a necromancer boiled down to how well he understood and could manipulate that energy. He leaned back in his chair. He sighed. I really need to work on that lens, he muttered to himself, dragging the prototype closer. Developing a spell to enhance his eyes to see death magic had been his first idea, but Dove's warning still rang in his head. Magic that influenced the eyes was dangerous. So his next idea had been to use a lens, much like the glass arcanists used when enchanting. Somehow, he'd actually succeeded, but not well enough for it to matter. With a frustrated expression on his face, he began to take his model apart. Mastering his art would be a long road, but if he was successful, his power would grow by leaps and bounds once he crossed the level 40 threshold. Chapter 120. Magister Piranus wasn't happy. Hurry up, he snapped to his manservant, and the man immediately began to bow and scrape. I'm sorry, Magister. Please forgive this humble servant. Don't stop working, you blithering idiot. Apologies, Magister. The young man immediately straightened and got back to adjusting Piranus's robes. He hated the formal robes. Multi-layered, tasseled, with gold chains running down the sleeves, they were cumbersome to the point of absurdity. Nervous of being scolded, or worse, disciplined, the servant's hands were now shaking, causing him to tangle 2 of the chains together. You dash! Piranus blew out a breath. Go away, he said coldly. You're worse than useless. The next time your work is this poor, I'll have you flogged. I thank you, Magister, the servant stuttered as he backed away. Piranus snorted and began fussing with the fine chains himself, finally untangling them after several curse-filled minutes. Irritated and red-faced, the Magister took a moment to compose himself before he pulled open the door and exited his chambers, only to have his mood immediately sour again. Hello there, Brother Herath greeted him, smiling broadly. Sent your manservant packing again, I see. Piranus eyed the blonde Magister through narrow slits, not bothering to hide his dislike. Herath, why are you loitering outside my chambers? Why, brother, what a thing to say. I merely thought to enjoy your company as we make our way to the council together. Well, that's grand. The two fell into stride beside each other, one sunny, the other thundering. The support of the Jorlans counts for a lot, Piranus remarked sourly. I'm surprised you're still on the council after your last scandal. My family dotes on me. It's true, Herath said modestly. They have been kind enough to forgive my momentary lapses in judgment. Piranus snorted. Misappropriation of funds, outright corruption. Of course, it was all swept under the rug, since the ones to lose out were slayers and commoners. Herath wasn't stupid enough to steal from the nobles. He'd have vanished the next day, and lived in agony for the rest of his days. Are you starting to sympathize with the cattle? Herath asked with a raised brow. We are the jailers. It isn't good to have tender feelings toward the jailed. From one of the larger noble families, these were the kinds of abuses Herath could get away with. You're accusing me of being soft on the slayers, Piranus said incredulously. Because I can't steal from them and avoid repercussions. Of course not. Just a word of friendly advice from your fellow council member. We are tasked with keeping the peace. We need to work together to hold back the tide. Of course. Herath continued to try and engage his contemporary in conversation as they walked, nattering on as Piranus grunted back at him. Together, they walked into the council chamber to find Grand Magister Tommat already in place at the head of the table. Take a seat, the old man rumbled, knuckling his thick, grey moustache. Don't look at his head. Don't look at his head. Piranus averted his eyes from the gleaming reflection of the firelight from Tommat's shiny, bald head. The flickering light had caught his attention at the last meeting, and he was paranoid the Grand Magister had noticed. Soon, the other members filed in and the council began. As it progressed, Piranus became increasingly unable to comprehend what he was hearing. Bickering over who was sent to the keeps, politicking to secure more plum rolls for this or that family, crackdowns on slayers within the city. Generic, blasé issues that they dealt with every week. After the first hour, he couldn't stand it anymore and interjected, cutting Magister Anlin mid-sentence. I beg the council's pardon, he began, incredulous, but are we not going to address what we've heard from Reynold Keep? Grand Magister Tommat knuckled his moustache and stared at him disapprovingly. Where is your decorum, brother? He rumbled. You have no call to disrupt the important business of the council with these baseless rumors. Herath tugged at his sleeve surreptitiously, but Piranus brushed him off. Anlin wants to make sure none of the churn are sent to supervise the slayers at the new rift in Cragwhistle, and we all know the council will agree, since they've been generous with donations lately. He glared across the table at Anlin, who just smiled and shrugged. Meanwhile, we've had reports of Slayer unrest on the rise for the past 4 years. Brand activations are at an 80-year high. 80 years. I only know that because I went into the record books to check. Ever since the Steelums died, there's been a steady increase in acts of defiance, and it has yet to be mentioned here in council. Once, Tommat slammed his fist down on the trouble as he glared at the younger Magister. Do you really think you can sit here and tell this body how to conduct its business? Is it you who chairs this discussion, Magister Piranus? Or do I? You, of course, Piranus said, with no remorse on his face. I simply submit to the council that this is an issue worth discussing. A ripple of scoffs and dismissive gestures ran around the table. The history of the brand as a method for controlling dangerous individuals in the Empire goes back thousands of years, Tommat stated. How are your concerns relevant to that sort of time frame? The Slayers are riled up after 2 of their most beloved and successful members were forced to sacrifice themselves in such an unfortunate manner. In a few years, they'll have settled back down again. It isn't the first or the last time this happened. Piranus couldn't believe his ears. Grand Magister Tommat, this latest incident occurred at Reynold Keep, just south of Kenmore itself. If things are getting that bad so close to the capital, what are they like at Sky Ice? Or Dustwar? Or Blackrift? Magister Anwin raised his hand, and Tommat nodded his permission to speak. Perhaps we may be able to strike 2 birds with 1 stone. Magister Piranus wishes for us to ascertain the extent of Slayer disruption far from the capital, and we are in need of a Magister to be posted in Cragwhistle. You piece of shit, Piranus raged. Grand Magister Tommat nodded thoughtfully. This suggestion makes sense. What say you, Magister Piranus? Anything to contribute before I put it to a vote? Piranus pushed back his chair as he stood. Don't bother to vote, I'll pack immediately. He glared across the table at Anwin. As usual, the actual work of the Magisters will fall to those from the minor families. Beside him, Herath sighed and shook his head. Once again, his colleague would suffer for his poor temper. Without another word, Piranus turned and stormed out of the chamber, slamming the door behind him. That stupid servant better pack his bags. By the gods, I refuse to suffer the freezing cold in the arse end of the Empire, while he slobs about in the city. Thunder boomed down the side of the barrier mountains as dark grey clouds rolled over the cliffs and poured down over the foothills. Cold and sharp, the wind cut like a blade as it whistled through the jagged rocks that thrust upward through the waving grass. Elsbeth drew her cloak tight around her shoulders as she glanced worriedly back toward the weary folk who trudged along in her wake. Not far now, she urged them with a wan smile, and the closest Dram nodded. Thank you, lass, he muttered, we'll be fine. Can you follow this path without me leading, Dram? I want to check on the others. Oh, course, he said, a little fire sparking in his eyes. I didn't come all this way to fall on me arse now. She gave him an encouraging pat on the shoulder before she turned and began to walk back down the line. They were a sorry-looking lot, suffering after several long weeks of travel. She came upon a mother traveling with her 2 children, all 3 looking haggard and worn. As the priestess walked past, the mother reached out to grasp her sleeve. Please, priestess, give us a blessing. Elsbeth stopped. Are you sure? The children also. The woman's mouth set in a hard line. Yes, if it pleases you. Over the years, Elsbeth had learned not to doubt the courage of these folk, even if she questioned their wisdom. It would do no good to argue. And this was what she was here for, was it not? Reaching out to the old gods wasn't like casting a spell. She knew that now. Magic was involved somehow. But what she did still held an element of the time before, when there were no rifts or kin. She reached deeply inward and found that which connected her to something far greater than she was. The blessing of the old gods be upon you. They see you, may you not be found wanting. Immediately, the woman stumbled as if a great weight had settled on her shoulders. Similarly, the children buckled. 2 boys, the oldest no more than 12, forced themselves back up, their faces determined, though she could easily read the pain in their expression. A blessing from the 3. Many wouldn't even call it a blessing, more like a curse. Attracting the attention of Crone, Raven and Rot meant they would test you, push you. The old gods were hard and cold. They helped those who helped themselves. Should this mother and her children push through the oppression that had been placed on them, there was a chance they could gain favor from one or more of the 3. They are strong. Watch as they struggle through, she prayed silently in her heart. Part of her still yearned to help them, to relieve their burdens. But she had come to terms with her gods and what they wanted. If she interfered, if she helped them in any way, then the blessing became meaningless. Worse than meaningless, since her help would offend the 3, and tempt them to bring calamity on the family, and on herself. Many invited the eyes of the old gods, and they could never be sure what might happen. There were no rules that they followed, no consistent or safe way to approach them. They may lay a light burden on someone who took their blessing, or they might shatter their heart on the spot. Further down the line, a man struggled to keep up, leaning heavily on another next to him. Are you all right? She asked as she rushed forward. Clearly injured, the man grimaced. Not sure I'll be able to make it. At this rate, priestess. Would you intercede with the rotten one for me? Another difficult request. Unlike the goddess, whose houses of healing provided divine comfort to those who arrived as supplicants, Rot was not so giving. There will be a price for any aid given. Are you still willing? Grim-faced, he nodded. I am, he said. Whatever Rot demands, I will pay. Again, she reached out through that connection which bound her and the gods together. Except this time, she reached for one specifically, the rotten one, and felt the deity assent. Rot infuses you with a portion of his strength. Do not waste it, for the price will be claimed at a later time. Almost immediately, the man sucked in a deep breath and clenched his teeth as vitality flooded him. His friend steadied him as he spasmed, the flesh of his leg mending in mere seconds. When it was done, he was dripping sweat and shaking, testing his leg with small, tentative steps. I thank you, priestess, he nodded. Now I will not be a burden. You're welcome, she said and smiled. Who knew what Rot would claim as his price? Perhaps the man would suffer a light fever and recover after a few days. Or perhaps the leg would be taken with gangrene and need to be removed entirely. Thankfully, there were no others who asked for her care, responding to her soft-spoken inquiries with wan smiles or weary shakes of the head. Several hours later, they arrived at their destination. Orton greeted them at the gate. "More?" he asked dourly, his face twisted into a frown. "I'm not sure we can take any more, Elsbeth. That's what you said last time, and the time before that, and yet still you survive. Even thrive. It's curious, isn't it?" Elsbeth put down her pack with a sigh and rubbed her shoulders. Her feet ached something fierce, and she desperately needed a bath after 2 weeks of hard travel. Orton's frown only deepened. "Are you talking about your gods?" he grunted. "I've not seen any evidence they're helping us, just flooding us with mouths that we can't afford to feed." "Are you sure they aren't your gods yet?" she asked, half teasing. "Most of the people out here worship the 3, not the 5. It's not like you can doubt their existence. You've seen my work." "How can I forget?" He sighed heavily. "Why are they sending all these people here, Elsbeth? I'm more than willing to help people in need. But this is getting out of hand." A question he had asked several times before. She didn't have any new answers for him. "I don't know for sure. They believe this place will be safe, protected by the necromancer. Some of the other priests and priestesses I've met think they're gathering followers for the first time in thousands of years, bringing their people together." At her mention of the necromancer, Orton's expression darkened. "Nobody believes he's even alive anymore. Do I take that to mean you've finally stopped dropping hints?" "He is alive." "I believe so," Elsbeth said simply, and forcibly changed the subject. "Now come on. Help me get these people something to eat and a place to rest. Unless you intend to leave them outside the gate." The big man sighed. "No, bring them in. I think I have a spot I can put them up." Chapter 121. Tyron stepped out of the back room and came face to face with Seri. "Oh, hell dash," he began. "Oh, good goddess," she gasped, a hand flying to her chest. "Master Armsfield, you look like death." The necromancer blinked and noted that his eyelids felt as though they scraped over sand as he did so. He blinked rapidly a few more times, trying to moisten his eyeballs. "Do I really look that bad?" he croaked. "Oh, I wouldn't say you look yes. I'm sorry." He waved her apology away. "No need to say sorry. I got caught up with a few things. I haven't slept in. I think, what day is it?" Seri stared at him for a long moment. "It's Celine's day," she said slowly. "I think you might need to have a rest, Master Armsfield." "Respectfully." "I'm fine," Tyron said, then paused and really assessed himself. If he were honest, he felt like shit scraped on moldy bread. 5 days without sleep, and he'd been working essentially non-stop. That wasn't a good habit to fall into. "You're right. I think I will get some sleep. Can you do me a favor and pass these on to Flynn?" He handed over a case of cores, and Seri took hold of it with wide eyes. "All right, I will." She toddled off, the padded box clutched tightly in her hands. Tyron watched her go before he stepped into the back room once again. He should go straight to bed. That's what he should do. Working any further in his condition invited disaster. He had no reason to be pushing himself this hard. He'd spent years constructing his position, so that there was no need for him to furtively experiment in the middle of the night. He had the luxury of being able to take his time, consider his steps, make careful and thoughtful strides in advancing his craft. Instead, he'd thrown himself into it like a drunk finding a new bottle, to the point he was barely keeping up with the demands of his shop. If people noticed he was short on goods for sale, they could reasonably be expected to start thinking about what he was doing with his time. Necromancy wouldn't be their first or even 50th guess. But any undue attention at all was to be avoided, no matter the cause. "I'll just take a quick look," he muttered to himself. After another 5 days, the saturation of death magic within the skeletons had become too strong for him to suppress. To even get them to last this long, he'd had to devise a method to draw out and disperse the energy to prevent the bones from assembling themselves into wild undead. Between that and working on his lens, there hadn't been much time for further experimentation. As he stepped into the basement, he quickly walked to his bench and picked up the lens. The craftsmanship wasn't anything special. In truth, the frame he'd installed the glass into was workmanlike and functional if he was being polite, and straight up crude if he wasn't. But the real prize was the glass itself, the enchantment scraped into the cores embedded in each corner. The network of cores embedded into each corner. Getting the lens to filter death magic so he could see it had been hard enough. Having it focus in and make it easier to see the minute levels of energy he was searching for had been a level beyond. It had taken him 3 whole days to crack it, but he was exceptionally pleased with the results. Of course, by that time, the level of energy in the bones was quite high, and it had been no trouble at all to see it. But even that inspection had proven fruitful. Mapping the movement through the various bones had been an interesting exercise. There was sure to be a reason behind the particular, almost consistent paths the magic took, but he hadn't been able to divine that. Even more important had been the moment he'd witnessed the transfer of energy with his own eyes, seeing the death magic vanish from one skeleton and reappear in another. Naturally, he'd known it was happening already, but being able to see it as well as sense it gave him another avenue, another sense he could use to discover how and why it happened. He'd been buzzing ever since and probably spent too long poring over the bones with the lens, examining each and every little detail, even if he was confident they weren't important or relevant. May as well do another pass, he muttered, as he picked up the lens and began to peer through it. He moved slowly about the room, checking each of the slabs carefully, scanning every stone, every cubic meter of space, until he was satisfied no death-aligned magic remained in his workspace. The bones themselves had been too dangerous to keep, so he'd disposed of them the night before. Of course, even dumping them in the sewer wasn't safe, as the possibility existed they would find a way to pull themselves together. So he'd gone a step further, and ground them to powder before tossing them into the sewage. With a little luck, those bones were many kilometers away. The sewer connected to the river, after all, and the river went straight to the ocean. His only remaining concern was that no trace of arcane energy remained for a passing mage to sniff out. Measures had been taken to suppress and dampen the emanations of the magic he performed down here, but nothing was foolproof. When he was satisfied nothing remained, he reluctantly put the lens down on his bench and picked up his book of notes, idly flicking through the early pages. The feverish scroll that greeted him brought a smile to his face. When he had just been starting out, every idea he'd had seemed as good as the next. Frequently, he'd found himself chasing multiple hares down multiple burrows, and the scroll he'd packed onto these pages reflected that. Half-formed ideas, partially baked sigil sequences, one after the next. He flipped forward and, gradually, some sort of order began to exert itself. Long hours on the back of that cart, scribbling away in this book, trying to find a way forward, had forced him to be more rigorous and focused. The influence of Dove also helped in that regard. As a person, the summoner had been careless, frivolous and unreliable, but as a mage, he had always taken his craft very seriously. With a sigh, Tyron put the book down and made his way upstairs, being careful to ensure he wasn't seen as he emerged from the basement, and then went up to his room. For now, his experiments would be on hold until he was delivered his next set of remains. It was frustrating, but he needed to be patient. If he dedicated himself to his enchanting work, then he should be able to build up a supply of goods he could draw on when he inevitably lost himself in his research again. When he finally collapsed into bed, he was almost instantly asleep and only awoke 12 hours later, in the dead of the night. He rose, scrubbed and dressed himself before he went hunting for something to eat. He was ravenous and suddenly couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten. He raided his pantry and found it limited, but devoured whatever he could find. Fed and rested for the first time in almost a week, he decided it was time to sit down and perform the status ritual. Since he'd resumed his necromantic activities, he hadn't checked his progress, so he hoped to see some gains in the key areas he was trying to develop. Despite it being the depths of the night and the shop being locked up, he wasn't comfortable performing the ritual outside of the basement. He walked through the empty store, taking note of the immaculate conditions his employees had left it in. I really need to be a little more careful. Less reputable people could have robbed the place blind, given his erratic schedule and infrequent appearances. Leaving Seri to lock up the store every night, a young girl who hadn't even awakened, seemed like putting a little too much on her shoulders. Once in the basement, he grabbed a fresh piece of paper, nicked a small cut in his thumb, and pressed it to the page. Soon enough, the familiar text began to appear as his blood crept over the page. He leaned forward eagerly to see what progress he'd made. His eyes ran down the page until he found what he'd been hoping to see. Your use of and experimentation with corpse appraisal has raised proficiency. Corpse appraisal has reached level 14. He'd hoped for 2 levels, but he would settle for 1. That meant the things he'd learned likely had practical applications. He simply had to discover what they were. Interestingly, there was another payoff as well. Your use and exploration of death magic has raised proficiency. Advanced. Death magic has reached level 13. More good news. His experimentation with the lens and observation of death-aligned energy in the bones seemed to have taught him something. Hopefully after the next set of remains, he could push both of these skills higher. Only when he was confident he was on track to reach level 20 in each, would he begin to work on corpse preparation. Several of his enchanting skills had also progressed due to his new and innovative application in developing tools. A welcome development, since they were notoriously hard to advance. Name: Tyron Steelum. Age: 22. Race: Human, level 19. Class: Undead Weaver, level 36. Subclasses: Forbidden 1, level 24. Focused Enchanter, level 40. None locked. Racial feats: level 5. Steady Hand, level 10. Night Owl. Feat selections available. 1. Attributes: Strength, 38. Dexterity, 99. Constitution, 122. Intelligence, 237. Wisdom, 156. Willpower, 110. Charisma, 43. Manipulation, 59. Poise, 59. General skills: Arithmetic, level 5 right parenthesis max. Handwriting, level 5 right parenthesis max. Concentration, level 5 right parenthesis max. Cooking, level 4. Sling, level 3. Swordsmanship, level 2. Sneak, level 3. Butchery, level 5 right parenthesis max. Engraving, level 5 right parenthesis max. Skill selections available. 4. Necromancer skills: Corpse appraisal, level 14. Corpse preparation, level 13. Advanced death magic, level 13. Bone mending, level 8. Minion commander, level 6. Undead control, level 4. Minion modification, level 5. Bone soul melding, level 5. Bone weapon sculpting, bow, level 4. Death infusion, level 1. Anathema skills: Abyss tongue, level 4. Arcanist skills: Expert magic scripting, level 29. Channeling, level 10 right parenthesis max. Pliance control, level 10 right parenthesis max. Expanded sigil formation, level 15. Core linking, level 10 right parenthesis max. Advanced fine motor control, level 14. Expert network formation, level 23. Advanced conduit magic, level 17. Advanced core sense, level 15. Expert power control, level 24. General spells: Globe of light, level 5 right parenthesis max. Sleep, level 5 right parenthesis max. Magic bolt, level 5 right parenthesis max. Magic eye, level 5 right parenthesis max. Necromancer spells: Raise dead, level 14. Bone animus, level 14. Commune with spirits, level 6. Shivering curse, level 6. Death blades, level 7. Empowered bone armor, level 5. Minion sight, level 6. Spirit binding, level 3. Death's grasp, level 5. Anathema spells: Pierce the veil, level 5. Appeal to the court, level 4. Dark communion, level 1. Suppress mind, level 10 right parenthesis max. Repository, level 6. Fear, level 3. Glamour, level 10 right parenthesis max. Invasive persuasion, level 10 right parenthesis max. Crone's shade, level 1. Bewitch, level 10 right parenthesis max. Necromancer feats: Skeleton focus 2. Magic battery 2. Bone mastery. Spirit mastery. Undead specialist. Anathema feats: Repository. Wall of thought 2. Drain life. Arcanist feats: Magic thread control 2. Compact sigils 2. Conduit seal 2. Core networking 2. Mysteries. Spell shaping advanced. Int plus 20. Wis plus 20. Words of power advanced. Wis plus 20. Char plus 20. Chapter 122. Couple of quick things Tyron announced as the staff gathered inside the shop prior to opening. First, I'm going to be taking a trip out of the city, starting next week. I'll be gone for approximately 6 days. That means you and I are going to be extremely busy making sure our storeroom is filled with stock, Flynn. Not a problem, Master Armsfield. I'm not afraid of hard work. Just make sure you let me know if you're getting too tired to work. Accurately, Tyron reminded him sternly. I applaud your enthusiasm, but sloppy work, I do not. The apprentice hesitated a moment before he nodded. Secondly, Seri, this will mainly impact you. So far, you've been responsible for opening and locking the store every day, and you've been faultless at performing this task even when I'm not around. I want to commend you on your dedication and professionalism, wonderful traits to have in someone so young. Even after you awaken, I want you to know you'll always be welcome to work here in this shop. I'll want a raise. Though the young woman smiled, full of pride at the praise she had received. After some consideration, however, I've decided I have been irresponsible in entrusting this work to someone so young. There is a lot of money and valuables kept in this store, and I would hate it if you were attacked by someone wanting to get inside. Seri went to protest, but Tyron held up his hand firmly. I know what you want to say, and as I said a moment ago, you have done excellent work, and I couldn't have asked any more of you. But I refuse to allow this job to put you in any danger. I have contracted another party who will be responsible for opening and closing the shop each day. He raised his voice. Come inside. The front door opened with a ring of the bell attached to the frame, and a woman clad in hardened leather armor stepped inside, a broad smile on her face. Hello, all, she said in a friendly tone. Nice to meet you. This is Wansa, a silver-ranked slayer who's decided to settle in the city for the time being. I've brought her on at the recommendation of people I trust, and I hope you can all work together. The three of them each said they could, some with more enthusiasm than others. Wansa continued to smile broadly. Seri looked a little sullen, and Flynn still looked a little dazed at Tyron's rebuke. He sighed. Wansa, find a spot to make yourself comfortable. But please don't interfere with Seri as she works the floor and handles transactions. Flynn, let's get upstairs and get to it. I've ordered quadruple of our normal shipment of goods this week, and I intend that the cores be carved and set before 7 days are done. Apprentice Flynn swallowed and nodded heavily. Of course, Master Armsfield. Still alive there, Flynn. The apprentice raised his head from his workstation, red-rimmed eyes staring back at Tyron with barely a flicker of life in them. He could almost picture the young arcanist as a zombie. I'm fine, Master Armsfield, just fine, he wheezed. Did you manage to get those cores set last night? I did. Great work. This is the last of them then. Tyron lifted the heavy case in his hands, filled with another 100 newly completed cores, and placed it carefully on the cluttered bench. Flynn looked as if he might cry. Go home and get some sleep, Apprentice Rivna, Tyron told him firmly. You can take your time with these. As long as they get done by the time I return, I'll be more than satisfied. Are you sure? Caught between exhaustion and his desire to keep up, Flynn wavered between a determined expression and a look that seemed as if he was sleeping sitting up. You've worked extremely hard this past week, much more than normal, and your output has been quality. I've no complaints. Go home. Right you are then, Master Armsfield. I'll just head on home. Although he wobbled a bit when he stood from his chair, Flynn was able to make it downstairs all right, though Tyron was still concerned. Seri, I'll watch the store for a bit. Can you make sure Apprentice Rivna gets home safely? I have pushed him too hard over the past week, and he's not all too steady. The young girl lowered her head and busied herself with shifting a few items back and forth, before she drew a deep breath and turned around. I'd be happy to, she beamed. Come on, Flynn, let's get going. Despite his mumbled protests, Seri took hold of one of his arms and practically dragged him out of the store. For his part, Tyron stretched his back and flexed his fingers, listening to them pop with satisfaction. Those two are sweet on each other, you know that right? Wansa said from her post near the door. Tyron frowned. They are. He'd not noticed any signs. The two seemed perfectly natural around each other. Or perhaps that was the sign. A casual, comfortable working relationship was all he thought had developed between the two. Was that unusual between two people of that age? I'm not sure why you keep the two of them around in the first place, Wansa said. My mistress could replace them in a day with much irk. The moment she said mistress, the necromancer's fingers had flashed through a sequence of sigils, and he slammed his mind into hers. It had become far too easy over the years to dominate the will of others in this manner. If only it weren't so necessary. He glared at the Slayer, whose blank eyes stared at nothing. What did I tell you about mentioning your mistress? He hissed. Or anything to do with them. With a contemptuous snort he released his grip on her, and the woman slumped forward, gasping. You are here because your mistress owes me, and I know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you can be trusted. And you can be trusted, can't you, Wansa? She glared back at him. Or should I have a word, a little chat, with your precious mistress? I don't think she'd like what I had to say. She may be quite mad at you, perhaps even abandon you. What would that be like, to never feel the touch of your mistress again? Wansa whimpered. The anger in her eyes immediately crumbled, replaced with desperate, naked fear. I'll be quiet, she breathed. I won't mention it again. You have my word. Good. He turned his back on her and returned to the counter, leaving Wansa to collect herself. Once a proud slayer who had fought for years at Undermist Keep, she had been reduced to her current state, after becoming entangled with Yor and her coven. Able to reduce even relatively strong slayers like Wansa to quivering addicts, the methods of the vampires were powerful, but distasteful to Tyron. Yor looked at Wansa as a capable servant fully able to utilize her mind and abilities, whilst being totally dependent. Tyron only saw a weak, trembling wreck. Emotional, unstable, and ultimately not to be depended on, these enslaved humans were a stopgap solution at best. He would rather have an undead by his side every time. Still, she was a much-needed layer of security, and was utterly loyal to her mistress to the point of insanity. No doubt she was reporting everything he did to Yor, but he could live with that. It wasn't as if he did much in the shop other than work anyway, but she could never be allowed to compromise his cover. Seri and Flynn gave him an added veneer of authenticity. An unawakened youth was the traditional salesperson of choice for those businesses who wanted to appear trustworthy. Customers could shop confident in the knowledge they weren't being manipulated by merchant skills or feats. Having an established apprentice like Flynn in his shop gave another layer, another connection to the trade and city at large. Replacing them with more bewitched slaves of the coven would not help him in any regard. He breathed out and let the tension drain from him. With no customers in the store, he pulled out the account books and began to go through them line by line. Just as he had for his Uncle Worthy so long ago, Tyron found it strangely soothing to work through the numbers. Seri kept a good record of each transaction, but her arithmetic wasn't perfect, and he made corrections here and there. All in all, the store continued to be very profitable. In any enchanting work, the cores were always the greatest expense, but limiting himself to the smaller grades, usually used for light, weak power cores, producing a little warmth and other such applications, saved him an immense amount of money. Compared to the vast sums of money Master Willem made on a daily basis, Tyron was living in poverty. But he had more than enough to fund his activities. With the added funds he earned from his share in Yor's business, he was on his way to becoming genuinely wealthy. He drew no pleasure from it. All he needed was enough to fund the resources he required to fulfill his purpose. Seri arrived back at the shop a half-hour later, and Tyron took a few minutes to point out the errors she had made, and let her know he had secured the safe in the back room for the duration of his trip. With that done, he went to his room and stretched his back and shoulders once more. A week solid of relentless enchanting work was nothing to him. After 3 years straight of endless grinding in his apprenticeship, he felt like he was only getting started. Barring any unexpected surges in demand, the store should be stopped for the next month, which would leave him plenty of time to complete his excursion and then research on his next set of remains. With the amount of time he'd bought himself, he should be able to research while maintaining a relatively normal sleep schedule. How luxurious. Still, there was little point in wasting any time. He stalked around his room, swiftly packed a small travel pack and set out. Just outside the western gate that led into Kenmore, a huge network of coaches and stables could be found just off the main road, which thronged with traffic at all hours of the day. Once there, he paid handsomely for a coach, climbed into the back and settled down to sleep. It would take almost 3 days to reach his destination, traveling around the clock. If possible, he'd like to avoid having to make this sojourn to the back country, but there were obligations he had to meet. The carriage had been rattling over a rough section of dirt road for several hours, and Tyrone was half certain his teeth were going to shatter if he didn't get some relief. At least he was sure they were approaching their destination. He'd paid for speed, a classed wagoner who could get the absolute most out of the horses he worked with, but perhaps he should have also sprung for a more padded coach. Something to consider next time. Or perhaps he was just getting soft, and should try to toughen himself up. Soon, the coach began to slow until it finally came to a stop, the horses huffing and whinnying with relief. "Here you are, sir," the wagoner, Eric, called. Tyrone grabbed his pack and opened the door, alighting to the ground with one wobbly step. "Thank you, Eric. It's a rough journey, and I thank you for persisting." The middle-aged, stubble-faced man grinned wearily. "That's what I'm paid for, sir." "How long until we head back?" "A little under a day, at most 12 hours at the minimum." "Well then, with your permission, I'll grab myself a bite to eat, something to drink, take a piss and get some sleep." "By all means. If you head to that house over there, they'll accommodate you." "Thank ye, sir." As the man trudged off, clearly fatigued, Tyrone took a deep breath of the fresh air. "Still smells like shit. Yet somehow. Still better than the city." As much as Kenmore had invested in sewers and sanitation, having so many people packed into such a small space was an impossible situation to manage. Shaytown stank even in the best areas, and the city itself was only marginally better, at least outside of the Golden District and Castle. Before him stood several large farmhouse buildings made from cut stone. Centuries old, the stone had a light covering of lichen and moss, as well as a few climbing vines that lent a sense of age to the place. "Master Armsfield," a voice greeted him, and he turned to see Rita Alden approaching. In her finely made clothing, the farm wife looked more like a prosperous merchant than a person of the land, though her thunderous expression betrayed her less than genteel temperament. "You're late," she said in clipped tones as she drew closer. "We expected you 2 weeks past." "I've been occupied," Tyrone replied coldly. If he'd left the corpses sitting in his basement for 2 weeks, they'd have saturated well before he could begin to work on them. Meeting the deadlines of his collaborators was secondary to advancing his own craft. "They don't care how occupied you are. You're to meet your end of the agreement." "I'm here, aren't I? If I arrive according to my own timetable rather than yours, that is something you will simply have to deal with." She scowled at him. "You may as well let your real face show. Your man is going to be fast asleep in 5 minutes." "I will drop my glamour," Tyrone said firmly, "when I am out of sight, and not before." Why was everyone he had to work with so stupid? Rita snorted. "You're on the Orton estate, with 2 days from the nearest city and an hour to the nearest farm. You're as secure as you can possibly be out here." She turned to lead him to one of the buildings, and paused after 3 steps when he didn't follow. "I want to go into the basement." "You've kept the venerable waiting long enough," she grated. "The old goat isn't going anywhere. I'll be there in 10 minutes. By rot, your disrespect will come back to haunt you one day, Steelham." Anger flashed in Tyrone's eyes at the use of his name, but he suppressed it. "Basement," he said. Mrs. Orton was furious, but she acquiesced, as he knew she must. A few minutes later, she withdrew a long key from her pocket, and used it to remove the heavy padlock from the cellar door. "I won't be long," he said, as he ducked his head and walked down the narrow steps into the darkness. Conjuring a magic globe, he extended his senses to check on his wardings. When he found them intact and undisturbed, he nodded with satisfaction. One couldn't be too careful. A few key phrases and a little sigil work later, he stood in a long, narrow chamber, the air heavy with dust and mildew. He empowered his globe, chasing back the shadows to reveal the contents of the cellar. At the back, row after row of skeletons, the light in their eyes so dim as to be reduced to a bare spark, almost impossible to see. Almost 50 in total, as there had been the last time he was here. He briefly inspected them, ensuring their condition hadn't deteriorated, before he turned to the shelf that ran down the left side of the room. Stones of irregular shapes and sizes rested there, each ingrained with a symbol. Moving down the chamber, he ran his hands along each of the stones, ensuring that each was in its proper place, until he came to the one at the end. This one he picked up and placed carefully in the center of the dust-covered stone floor. He stood over it for a moment, contemplating, before his hands began to move, fingers flickering through a rapid series of sigils. When he was done, mist began to rise from the stone, forming a cloud of chilling white right in front of him. From within the haze, a wailing, defeated voice emanated. "Let me die," Rufus begged. Tyron stood coldly, staring at the trapped spirit. One corner of his mouth lifted the smallest fraction. "No," he said. Chapter 123. "I apologize for keeping you waiting," Venerable Tyron said as he bowed his head. A wheezing cackle came from the emaciated figure sat on the large wooden throne at the back of the room. "No you don't," the old man rasped. "You couldn't give a shit, but that's fine. I don't think the three of them care much either." He waved a lazy hand up toward the three figures carved and hung on the wall above his head. The two-faced lady, the storm-eyed bird, the withered tree, crone, raven and rot. Tyron eyed the three of them, trying to conceal his distaste. He had never forgiven the old gods for attempting to force his submission, and had been leery of them ever since, which had led to some difficulties when it came to fulfilling the terms of his advanced subclass. "It's not like they can't see what you're up to," the Venerable said, his voice so thin it was barely above a whisper, "despite your attempts to conceal yourself from their eyes." For a moment, the old man lifted his brows to reveal eyes filled with lightning. Tyron averted his gaze and shifted uncomfortably. The Venerable chuckled and let his wrinkled brow sink low once again. "Thrice blessed Venerable, I've come to hear the word of the three, and fulfill the terms of our agreement. What do the old gods have to say?" After a short silence, the old man wheezed a shallow laugh that quickly turned into a fit of coughing. When he was done, the Venerable lifted himself on shaking arms so thin he appeared almost skeletal. He reached out to take hold of his staff, and leaned heavily on it as he walked. "Come on, you little shit," he rasped. "I want to go outside." Are you sure that's wise? I've been blessed by three gods as old as this damned realm. You think you can tell me what's wise? You still stink of your mother's tit." Tyron ground his teeth and reined in the flash of anger that threatened to choke him. Despite his fragility, there likely wasn't anything he could do to this decrepit old man, and the Venerable knew it. Besides, he had no idea how old this geezer was. The Venerable might be 100 or 1,000 for all he knew. Apparently, he'd lived here on the Olden estate since it was established, which was at least 200 years, but despite his best efforts, he'd uncovered absolutely no information about him. As far as public records went, the man didn't exist, nor did any rumor of his existence. "Come and help me, disrespectful brat," the Venerable grumbled, and Tyron forced himself to take him gently by the shoulder, supporting him as he made his way through the house. "Venerable," Rita said as she caught sight of them, her eyes widening with alarm. "Are you well?" "Just getting a little fresh air, my dear," he replied. "Young Master Steelum will assist me. No need to worry yourself." She hesitated, eyes flickering to Tyron and back. "Are you sure?" Of course," he waved her off with a stick-thin arm. "Be at ease, girl." She was likely 40 years old, but looking as he did, he could call her a toddler and get away with it. When they reached the outside, the old man stepped blinking into the sunlight, raising his head to the warmth of the light. A few wisps of hair still clung to his skull, reminding Tyron of the stubborn grasses he'd seen on the barrier mountains rooted into the bare, unforgiving stone. "You're thinking disrespectfully," the old man noted querulously. "Stop it, and help me over to that rock. That one gets the most sun." "Fine." When he finally got situated, the Venerable lowered himself with a sigh and pulled his loose-fitting robes a little tighter around his shoulders. "Gets a bit too cold for my old bones this far north," he said. "I lived close to the desert in my youth, and sometimes I feel like I never adapted. The chill gets right through me." "There's not a lot it has to get through," Tyron noted, but kept his mouth shut. "What do you think the old gods are?" the Venerable asked suddenly, and Tyron suppressed a sigh. Every time he came up here, he was forced into discussion about the three that he simply had no interest in. "Ancient creatures of immense power and malevolent nature," he answered honestly. The Venerable chuckled. "You aren't all that wrong, really. The three are pricks. You hear me up there, pricks?" He raised his staff and waggled it weakly at the sky. "But of course they seem like assholes to us. How nice are you to ants? Or worms? They were born along with this realm, far before humans or the dust folk came here. It belongs to them far more than it belongs to us. They didn't defend it, so they lost their claim." Tyron shrugged. "If they want to control the realm, then they need to get up and do something about it." The motivations of the three were difficult for him to understand. It seemed like they wanted things, but weren't willing to exert any of their massive power or influence to get it. Even their followers seemed mad to him. They begged for an intercession that may harm far more than it helped. What was the point? You think of them as if they were logical actors, the Venerable noted. Once again, he revealed his lightning-filled gaze. That is a mistake. Tyron nodded, chastened. Crone, Raven and Rot. They feel no desire to be understood by the likes of you. No need to be comprehended. They will do whatever the fuck they want, and there isn't a damn thing every living creature clung to this fracturing rock can do about it. And who knows? Perhaps their actions are perfectly logical from their perspective. Tyron doubted it. You little shit, the Venerable wheezed a chuckle. I can read your thoughts on your face, plain as day. Let me ask you this. Are you a multi-dimensional force of nature? No. Then you have a fart's chance in a fireplace of figuring out what those three pricks want or need. It was a valid point, and something for Tyron to consider. The Venerable shifted on his rock and gazed out over the rolling hills. South lay Kenmore in all its glory, and to the northwest was Northwatch, and beyond them Blackrift and Undermiss Keeps. It was green here, warmer than it was further west. Perfect farming country. You've found more success with the vampires because you find you can understand them better. They're transactional. They were once humans. They think much the same way you do, except on a much longer timescale. The Venerable nodded to himself. But it's an illusion. In reality, you don't understand them, or what they truly want. They are able to pretend they were human. They remember what it was like, some of them at least. But it isn't genuine. They are dead, with a heart that beats for nothing and no one. If you depend on them too much, they will draw you in and bleed you dry. I'm being careful, Tyron said stiffly. Bullshit, the Venerable snorted and extended one gnarled pointed finger towards his face. You lean on them for everything, and rush to do their bidding to repay the favor. You aren't safe from them. The only thing that can protect you from the Dark Ones is another of those powers. So you want me to lean on you instead. I don't trust the three, and I'm not sure that I ever will. Even the Abyss hasn't tried to suppress my will and dominate my mind. No, but they will try and drink your soul if you aren't careful. Those secrets you chase are expensive, and it will lure you deeper every time you have a question. Am I wrong? He wasn't. The few times he had called on the Abyss over the past few years had been tantalizing. Hints of knowledge and mastery that he yearned for, but wasn't granted. Each time, he was asked to step further into the void to get what he wanted. You chose to serve three masters, the Venerable noted, because you thought the only way to survive was to play one against the other. As good a strategy as any, I suppose. But it's not going to fucking work when you ignore one of the masters entirely. After a moment of hesitation, Tyron nodded reluctantly. It was true. He was getting too deep with the court, too comfortable calling on them for favors, and paying the prices they demanded. For now, they wanted resources, influence. But soon, they would begin to ask for more, ask for things he wasn't so willing to part with. What do they want? He finally said. The Venerable chuckled, then coughed and hacked before spitting up a hunk of phlegm. Hack? Ah, that's better. They want a few things. Since they've been waiting so long, they want to speak to you themselves, which will mean enacting the ritual you've avoided for so long. For everything else, they will send an intermediary to work with you more closely. Can't expect you to go gallivanting to the forest every time they want a word. The necromancer clenched his teeth, but released them slowly. He didn't have good memories of that place. And he certainly didn't want some idiot priest poking their nose around his business and risk exposing him. I have a need for discretion, he ground out. You think us followers of the three don't? You idiot. Ever seen what happens when they find us? It isn't pretty. Don't worry, we'll be careful. The old gods might not give a shit, but we do. The old man reached around and scratched his backside before he sighed. I'm done. Can you go tell Rita to bring me a blanket? Then you can fuck off. Thanks, Tyron said sourly. Don't die on me before I get back. Low cackling followed him into the house as Tyron found the owner. There was still time before he had to travel back to the city. He stepped outside and oriented himself before he began to trek east toward the mist-covered woods that bordered the property in the distance and spread toward the horizon. It had been too long since he'd cleaned the grave. Folletta smiled at him as he emerged from the shadows in the sower. It was a smile he didn't much like. Predatory, like yours often was, but also playful, like a cat staring at a bird. Elton, she purred, how lovely to see you again. Tyron suppressed a sigh. "The pleasure is mine." He executed a short bow, and the woman's eyes glowed with delight. She really was desperate for a taste of good manners. "Another 20 of Kenmore's finest corpses," she said, gesturing for her men to step forward. One by one, they lay their burdens down on the grating, tightly wrapped linen bundles of 2 corpses each. "Excellent," he breathed. The first set had proven to be extremely fruitful for his research, but had only opened his eyes to possibilities. He had so much follow-up work to do before he could confirm any of it. "I've never seen someone so pleased to see a corpse," Folletta observed, a slight smile tugging at her lips. "Let alone this many." Tyron stepped forward and passed her the purse directly. "Your payment." Even more than before, her eyes gleamed at the sight of gold. "And I presume you want the same again next month," she said. "I do." He hesitated a moment. "I would also like to inquire about an additional transaction." "Oh." Her eager gaze flicked to his as she wet her lips. "And what might you be looking for?" "Bones." "Bones?" She glanced down at the corpses. "Don't you have enough bones already?" He shook his head. "No." "What sort of bones would you require?" she asked, curious. "Human, in decent condition, not crumbling, not splintered preferably." She considered for a moment, eyeing him. "I believe we can do this, but I would like to have another meeting in which we discuss the price and time of delivery." That was reasonable. "Shall we say, here, same time, in a week?" She frowned. No, that won't do at all. Let us say, tomorrow, at the evening bell, in the Golden Gateway." If he wasn't mistaken, isn't that a restaurant in the city? She smiled at him, again, part predator, part play. "Why yes it is." Chapter 124. Once the bodies were safely stowed in his study, Tyron took a moment to think about Folletta's proposition. She wanted them to discuss the sale of bones at an upmarket eatery inside the walls. It didn't seem altogether prudent. In fact, it seemed like out-and-out madness. But she wasn't to be dissuaded. At least he would be able to appear with his Elton face, and not his Lucas one. Detaching the entrepreneurial enchanter from any criminal enterprise was of utmost importance. And if he were honest, he didn't want to spend any more time in Folletta's presence than he absolutely had to. But he did need bones. He was able to craft bows and arrows from them already. It shouldn't be too hard to work out how to make swords and axes, given the knowledge he possessed. If he could figure that out, he'd save himself valuable skill selections, and save a fortune in outfitting his minions. "I need to test how well bone adapts to enchantments as a material," he thought to himself. "If it's better than metal, that would be an unexpected plus. Getting a random mix of bones should be much easier than sourcing whole, intact skeletons. So hopefully, they wouldn't gouge him too much. They may be useful for practicing his threading technique, also another core skill he needed to work on." With a shake of his head, he pushed any thought of the upcoming discussion from his mind. He'd been waiting 2 weeks for more materials to work with, and he'd be damned if he'd waste the opportunity in front of him. After the butchering and disposal was complete, Tyron began to study the remains in detail. He took his enchanted glass, he really needed to come up with a name for it, in both hands, and began to pass it over the bones. About the size of a large dinner plate, the lens didn't allow him to see through it in the traditional sense. When he stared at it, what he saw was the tiny threads of death magic within the bones, rather than the bones themselves. It was fascinating to see the process of saturation so early in its cycle. A healthy, living person contained not a trace of death magic in them, and nor did a terminally ill one, he checked. Only after a person died did their body begin to take in ambient magic and transform its attribute. Slowly, over time, the process accelerated, saturating the bones fully and giving rise to wild undead. Though this didn't occur in all places, some locations, it seemed, were more conducive to the formation of death magic than others. Most gravesites, for example, were selected with this in mind and built in places where the dead wouldn't stir, though people had to be careful. If they buried too many in too short a span, that could give rise to undead. Tyron thought that phenomenon was due to the newly dead being more capable of forming links with each other, thereby sharing and multiplying the death energy they contained. For this reason, most of the deceased in Kenmore were cremated, though there were many private plots outside of the city, and very few, very exclusive ones within. He moved from one slab to the next, carefully annotating the progress of the saturation in each, and once again set his silver wire experiment. If he could identify which were more capable of sharing energy from their saturation growth, then he wouldn't need to use the wire at all in future. For the next step, he approached a heavy sack he'd slung in one corner and opened it, removing a handful of the fine crystals within. He let them trail through his fingers before he fetched a heavy leather glove. Bone salt, this substance was called, though it didn't really relate to bones, or affect them at all, which was why he wanted it. Merchants in the core trade used it when they bought fresh cores from Slayer expeditions to clean them. By rubbing the core with the alchemical salt, a reaction would occur between organic matter and the gem, removing any blood, ichor or grime that remained. Merchants, and more importantly, arcanists, did not like to work with filth-encrusted cores. As he understood it, the bone salt shouldn't react to his own living flesh, but he didn't want to chance it and lose a hand. He hauled the sack to the middle of the room, removed a handful, and began rubbing down each of the skeletons, one by one. It was a painstaking process, given the absurd number of bones in the human body. 206 bones for 20 skeletons turned out to be a lot of bones. He wasn't too fussed with the smaller ones, rather he wanted to make sure the larger bones were scrubbed clean. The hypothesis went that by removing any trace of flesh and blood, the skeletons would make better skeletons. Either the threading would take better to the bones, or the raised dead spell would perform better, or the death magic would accumulate faster inside the bones, if there weren't superfluous matter around. He left 5 skeletons untouched by the salt as a control group, keen to see the differences between them. Careful observation over the next few days would hopefully teach him a great deal. Unwilling to test too many ideas at once, he reluctantly let his efforts rest there, and turned his attention to other matters he could spend his time on. The raised dead ritual, the cornerstone of the necromantic arts. As his last feat selection, he had raised the level cap on this ritual yet again, and he was determined to reach it before he achieved level 40. It would be a difficult thing to achieve. He gained levels as an undead weaver for advancing his craft, as well as for using it. Even if he created no minions at all, simply learning and discovering enough to reach his goals may bring him to the advancement. Hopefully not. Opening his old notes, he began to pore through them, taking what he thought was valuable, and discarding the rest, as he began to compile a new base from which he could build his understanding of this complex piece of magic. Since those early days, his knowledge of conduits in particular had expanded dramatically, and those early writings appeared exceedingly amateurish in his eyes. What he could construct now, compared to back then, would be a difference of night and day. If done correctly, he could reduce energy waste between himself and his minions by nearly half compared to what it had been before. Engrossed in the work, he lost track of time until after lunch the following day. Shit, he muttered as he stormed down the streets of Kenmore. Between his examination of the remains and the sigil work he'd been doing, reconstructing the conduit magic and raised dead from the ground up, he'd completely forgotten about his meeting with Folletta until it was almost too late. He'd been so flustered, he'd almost emerged from the sewers wearing the wrong face. I should have worked out a spot where I could switch identities outside of my own home without arousing suspicion. I could have gone to yours. A dangerous thought, one he pushed away as soon as it intruded. The Venerable hadn't been wrong when he said Tyron had turned to the Coven far too easily. This was something he could solve himself without bartering or favors, so he should. His backup plan had been to emerge from the sewer in a neglected part of town, then head to a clothier for a new set of clothes, and then to an inn equipped with bath facilities to get rid of the stink. When he emerged, Elton had never looked better, in a fine set of pants with an elegant robe layered over his silk shirt. Freshly tubbed and scrubbed, Tyron felt more refreshed than he had in years, and made a mental note to schedule a regular wash as part of his routine. He'd been getting by with soap and cold water for too long. A little civilization might do him some good. All of his preparations took time, however, and the evening bell rang across the city, just as he arrived outside the Golden Gateway. An opulent building, to say the least. The entire facing was formed of cut marble, with decorative carvings and statues lining the street outside. A line of people, dressed far more finely than he, waited in line, perfuming themselves and fluttering fans, as they gossiped and laughed in the cooling air. Somewhat hesitant and unwilling to be late, he approached the oversized gentleman at the door, who immediately frowned at him. "I'm here to see Folletta," he said, hopefully. "Get to the back, oh Folletta. You say, would you be Mr. Elton? Yes, I am. Step right through, sir. Under the envious gazes of those still in line, Tyron stepped inside, only to be whisked to a private dining room. Before he could acclimate himself, he got half an impression of ornate flower arrangements and gleaming silverware, before he was sat at a table across from Folletta, who looked different than what he was accustomed to. You scrubbed up pretty well, Elton, she smirked, taking a sip of dark, red wine, and eyeing him over the rim. The necromancer shifted uncomfortably. Ah, thank you. You as well, he said. This was a profoundly uncomfortable environment for him, though he tried not to let it show. I've never eaten here before, he said. I wasn't quite sure what to expect. I'm afraid I'm a little underdressed. Folletta herself was stunning in a tight-fitting green dress that left her shoulders bare, her dark red hair tied up with coals hanging loose behind her ears. He'd not realized she had red hair. It was too dark in the sewer to notice, or perhaps he hadn't been paying enough attention. You idiot, that's not her real face. She can change the color of her hair just as easily as you can. You probably didn't expect the thief you do business with to eat in such an upmarket place. She smiled as she said it. Tyron winced. Not to worry, she assured him with a wink. Our privacy is assured here. This place has close ties to my kind of people, if you take my meaning. Ah, he noted. She must have noticed something in his expression, and she chuckled lightly, swirling the wine in her glass before draining it. I'm guessing you didn't expect we would meet somewhere like this. You probably expected something a little more rustic. He nodded, seeing no reason to mince words. I did. Going from our previous place of business to this, he gestured around the spacious and meticulously appointed room, is something of a shock. Folletta grinned. I don't have much reason to come here, most of the time. In my line of work, I deal with sailors, thugs and petty crooks more often than not. It's nice to have an excuse to bring a client out here. I enjoy a taste of the finer things every now and again. And I presume you would rather wait to talk business. She smiled again, that slow, predatory smile. I would. Tyron settled back in his seat with a sigh. Although this was a pleasant environment, and though he may be reluctant to say it, the company was stimulating. A part of him was still back in his study, calculating and taking notes. Folletta clearly appeared interested in him, even he could see that much, though he was utterly unable to determine if those intentions were sincere. The entirety of his romantic experience could be summed up with a childhood crush on Elsbeth that had never gone anywhere. How was he supposed to act in this situation? He had no idea. I had you pegged as a thinker, Folletta said, and he jerked his gaze back to hers, and found her laughing silently. You were 1,000,000 kilometers away the second I said you'd have to wait. That had been rude of him. I'm sorry, he said. I'm not very accustomed to, he waved a vague hand, this. She nodded sympathetically. You're a virgin? She inquired, arching one brow. Yes, he nodded. Folletta blinked, then laughed, her hand slamming into the table. Usually, men are far more embarrassed to make a revelation such as that, she chuckled, her eyes dancing with mirth. I hardly think lying would have done me any good. I'm not the best of actors, he pointed out. No, I'm starting to get a better sense of who you are. She eyed him with interest. You're not the social type, you're a thinker, a little awkward, but there's a fire burning in you just below the surface that just, she shivered, warms me up inside. So let me be blunt, because I think that's the kind of approach you will appreciate the most. Thank the gods, Tyron thought. Folletta placed her hands flat on the table and stared him directly in the eye. As you are well aware, Folletta is not my real name, and this is not my real face. The same is true for you. I like this arrangement. It creates a separation, a sense of distance, of mystery, if you will. Secondly, I sense an air of danger around you, an intensity that I find fascinating. I have no interest in learning more about what you do, or why you do it. I have a different purpose entirely in mind. She leaned forward, and Tyron leaned forward also as she stared straight into his eyes, her expression serious. I want to fuck, she said, and leaned back. Tyron blinked several times. She watched him carefully as she poured herself another glass of wine. That's direct, he said. Then he frowned, and unwise. It is both of those things. But I know that you will agree. I have a surefire method of persuasion that works on people like you. He couldn't imagine that would be the case, but something else bothered him. Why? He asked. I find you fascinating, and I have an unhealthy interest in dangerous people. For some reason I can't quite figure out. I feel you are very dangerous. And why would I agree? She pouted at him. He rolled his eyes. You're lovely, of course, but entangling myself with a member of a criminal enterprise seems excessively foolish. Because she purred, you're having trouble raising your race levels to 20. Shit. Folletta grinned and raised her glass. What's your constitution score like? She asked. He stared at her with hooded eyes. Hi. Chapter 125. Tyron stalked through his lab, unsure how to feel as he checked on his experiments and scribbled down measurements in his notes. It was promising to note that his tests had been progressing in line with his expectations. Either he was lucky, or he was on the right track. The work he'd done on the raised dead spell form had come a long way as well. In another few days, he would have completed his reconstruction of the conduit magic built into the ritual, and already he was confident it would be a dramatic improvement. An interesting wrinkle was that the bones he had scrubbed clean of any flesh and blood were accruing death magic faster than those without. Did the flesh and bone interfere with each other, or did the decaying strips of matter take in some of the energy, slowing the absorption rate of the bones? Probably the latter, since a zombie had death-attuned energy in its flesh and bones, although far more in the flesh. Another thing for him to investigate. No, his successful experiments and developing research weren't what was irritating him, but rather his encounter with Folletta 2 days prior. Against his better judgment, he had agreed to her suggestion, and he wasn't sure if he was annoyed at himself for going along with it, or with her for the fact that it had worked. To gain race levels as a human wasn't an overly complex process. One had to form meaningful relationships and interact with others. Humans were, by and large, a very social race, more prone to collective action than other, longer-lived species. That was fine for most people, but for Tyron, he'd always found it difficult to trust others or engage with them on a level playing field, a trait that had grown infinitely worse after his parents had died. Though he had made attempts to form friendships, such as his association with Vic, but with the many layers of deception placed between himself and others, a true connection was almost impossible to form. As such, he had stagnated, the coveted third-class slot just out of his reach, which he needed, since one of his options had been taken by the trio of Dark Ones. Folletta had proposed a dramatic solution to his problem. It wasn't necessary to engage in a sexual relationship to level as a human, far from it, but as a method to break down his barriers and get closer to him. It had been scarily effective, and that irritated him. Was that all it took to get through to him? Paradoxically, the success of the measure only made him more insecure. When the status ritual had confirmed he had gained a race level, his heart had tried to leap and sink at the same time. He needed the race levels, but he did not welcome emotional attachment. Not now, not with everything he was trying to achieve. Surrounded by the dead and darkness within the basement, Tyron sighed. In the corner, he had stashed the bag of bones he'd collected from Folletta's goons the previous day. He was yet to start work on them. Perhaps when he was done with his current set of remains, he would get to work attempting to shape swords, spears and shields to equip his minions. But for now, with an irritated grunt, he pushed his notes away and rubbed at his temples. This wasn't as productive as it should be. He was distracted. Perhaps if he took a little time to clear his head. Taking his usual precautions, the necromancer emerged from below ground and moved surreptitiously through the store, aiming to creep upstairs. Some rest, a bit of food and water, would surely screw his head back on right. As he placed his foot on the first step, he noticed an unusual atmosphere within the store. It was quiet, but more than that, it felt tense. Confused, he backed up and walked around to poke his head through the door to view the shop floor. Sari stood, as usual, behind the desk, a forced smile on her face, as she fidgeted nervously with the hem of her dress. Wansa sat in her customary place by the door, though her normal, relaxed posture was nowhere to be found. Instead, she was tense, a hand on her weapon, as she eyed the lone figure moving amongst the merchandise. Tyron's breath caught in his throat, and Sari noticed him, rushing forward and clutching at his sleeve. Master Armsfield, she whispered urgently. They came in a few minutes ago, and the place emptied out in seconds. What do you want us to do? Wansa could kick them out, but I wasn't sure if you were happy to sell to them. Dust folk? This one appeared just as he had read they would, covered from head to toe in thick, rough wraps, stitched with their own iconography. To his magical senses, they pulsed with a strange and alien energy, something he hadn't experienced before. Don't worry, Seri, I'll talk to them myself. The girl sagged with relief before she moved back to her post, appearing far more comfortable now that he had stepped in. With a gesture, he indicated to Wansa to calm down before he moved around the desk and approached the stranger himself. Welcome, he said, speaking a little slowly and enunciating carefully. This is Umsfield Enchantments and I am Master Umsfield. How can I help you? The covered figure turned toward him, and he found it disconcerting to be face to face with someone who revealed nothing of their features. Fear, not human, I speak your tongue. Do not address me as one of your mewling, little squishy things. I forget this word, the helpless ones. Child, or children. Yes, that one. I am not one of your soggy-bottomed children. I speak clearly. Yes. You speak our tongue very well. Yes. See, I have to learn to trade for tribe. Still, it is difficult to buy when so many are unwilling to sell. Are you willing to sell? The voice was like nothing Tyron had ever heard. There was a rustling, like sand sliding down a dune every time they spoke. I am indeed willing to sell, he affirmed, and he heard Seri peep somewhere behind him. That is unexpected, but good. Yes, there isn't many who will sell your enchanted trinkets to my people. They are probably willing, but unlikely to do so where others can see, Tyron noted dryly. I'm more open-minded, but even so, conducting our business away from prying eyes will be better for both of us. What kind of eyes? Where people can't see us. If you wouldn't mind stepping into the back room, we can discuss what you need. Ah, yes. Tyron led the wrapped figure by Seri, who trembled on the spot, and into the room in which most of the setting was done. A flat wooden table with several seats could be found there, and he invited his customer to sit. Is there a name I should address you by? Cash. Humans and their names. Call me Shadow, yes. Would you care for any food or drink before we discuss your needs? Shadow slashed the air with one hand in refusal. No, it is Al-Hakash. Forbidden. I apologize, no offense was meant. Tyron seated himself, trying not to let his eagerness show. So, what are you looking to purchase? Filters, coolers, ovens, purifiers, water sources. Yes, many water sources. Tyron had no doubt of that. The desert to the south in which the dust folk made their homes was unimaginably dry, to the point that water enchantments would break down due to prolonged exposure to such conditions. You'll need to be specific about the requirements for each of those, Tyron noted with a frown. Umsfield Enchantments specializes in affordable, efficient, low-power options. If you want something stronger, I'll need to make it custom for you. I noticed your prices, and the cores you use. Frugal. Is this the word? Yes. I like this. My people like to make much with little. I have the requirements written in your tongue. Shadow reached within their wraps, loosing one strand with a finger, sliding it in, and withdrawing a flat, folded piece of worn parchment. As he reached out to take it, Tyron noticed sand trickling from the page onto his table. The writing was rough, but legible, and he ran his eyes down the specifics. It was clear that whatever group or tribe Shadow came from weren't overflowing with resources. None of the enchantments they were asking for were the best available, or even close. I can give you what you need. Much of this I have in stock, although if you are willing to wait, I can produce superior versions that should exceed your requirements. With not even their eyes exposed, it was impossible to read Shadow's expression, but he could tell they were interested. Why would you do this? I will not pay more than is written. Yes, I cannot, since I do not have more. That's not an issue. There are things I am interested in more than money. This was a delicate moment. How to broach this issue? He rose and approached the door, making sure Seri wasn't listening on the other side. Before he closed it again softly, he turned to see Shadow had risen from their seat, arms folded across their chest. What deviant things are you planning? Shadow will have no part in them. Tyron blinked. What? No. Please be seated. My interest is in magic. Restricted magic. I didn't want to be overheard. Magic, Shadow said doubtfully, still postured defensively. Yes, Tyron slapped a hand to his face as he sat down again. Magic. There's a particular type of magic that is much more common in your lands than mine. I am interested in securing knowledge rather than more money. I can be discreet, yes. However, this request is difficult depending on what you ask for. My people will share some things willingly, others not so much. I'm mainly interested in construct magic. Your people are known to be incredibly resourceful when it comes to this particular branch of enchanting and crafting. As much as he wanted to come out and ask for spellbooks and forms related to necromancy directly, he didn't want anything to tie Lucas Umsfield to the undead. Not even loosely. Shadow folded their arms and leaned back in their chair. This will be difficult. Some things, yes. Some things can be shared, but others. Cash. No. But Shadow cannot say yes or no. It is not for me. Yes. That's fine. I'll complete this transaction for you. As I said, at no extra price. The next time you need to restock, bring back whatever you can. Based on what you have, we'll see what else I can do for you. I agree, Shadow pronounced, before they bowed their head over the table. Chanrella, this is pleasing. This trade will be good for my people. I hope it is profitable for both of us, Tyron smiled. If he could get his hands on something useful from the dust folk, it would be another avenue for him to improve his craft. In the desert, they used a number of different constructs, including undead ones, to perform tasks in the scorching heat. Constructs didn't need to drink or eat, they didn't care about the sand winds which cut flesh like paper. Tyron stood. If you return here in 2 days' time, I'll have everything ready for you. If you could do me a favor, though, please arrive after the store closes. It will be easier for both of us if you draw less attention. Yes, Shadow waved a hand. I am used to this. I thank you. Without another word, the wrapped figure rose and strode from the store. The necromancer blew out a breath before he strode back into the store. Our client will be back after the store closes in 2 days. Seri. He looked her in the eye. I hope that isn't an issue. She looked like she wanted to say something, but held her tongue. And just like that, he'd taken on even more work. To deliver on what he had promised, he would need to alter his normal patterns, which meant design work would be necessary. He couldn't leave this to Flynn. He stretched and cracked his fingers. It would be a long couple of nights. Chapter 126. Vic, I haven't slept in 2 days. I'm going to need you to use plain language for a change. That's difficult. The exalted blood within my veins demands I speak in as roundabout terms as possible. What exalted blood? Your dad is a merchant and your mother is a jeweler. You're as noble as I am. As much as the Armsfield name rings throughout the land, there is a key difference between our families. Mine is exceptionally wealthy. Get to the fucking point. Vic. Tyron dragged a hand down his face. I'm tired and I'm not in the mood for your delusions of grandeur. The necromancer had been engaged in a frenzy of work since his unexpected visit from Shadow. Completing the order had required a furious pace of activity, but doing so while upkeeping his experiments had been exhausting. Luckily, the task had been completed on time, and the delighted dust folk had departed back to the desert with the goods in tow only hours before Vic had arrived and begun pounding on his door. You wound me. I haven't visited you in weeks, and this is the welcome I get. This welcome is about to get a lot less friendly. Tyron glared. The guard behind Master Willem's apprentice stepped forward, a frown on his face, only for Tyron to turn his stare in his direction. At least welcome me inside. Damn it, Vic sighed. It's getting cold out here, and I'm worried I'll get murdered. You're perfectly safe, you coward. Nevertheless, he stepped aside and allowed his associate into the store. Looks like business has been ticking along nicely, the arcanist observed as he walked between the glass cases of displayed wares, noting the various sold-out items. Perhaps you weren't as crazy as I thought you were when you opened this place. Come on, Vic, please get to the point. I'm not kidding when I tell you I'm exhausted. Another time, I would love to invite you in for tea and biscuits, but I've just filled a big order, and I need some fucking sleep. Out with it. The well-dressed apprentice sighed and pouted. Fine. He reached into his coat, frowned, fumbled at several pockets before he smiled and withdrew a sealed envelope. With a small flourish, he presented it to his friend, who took it with a weary expression plastered on his face. The Lady Shan is throwing a ball tomorrow evening, and I not only have an invitation, but have also been given the privilege of granting an additional seat at the table. Naturally, I thought immediately of you, my dear friend, to take advantage of this rare opportunity. Master Willem pulled out at the last minute, didn't he? I mean, what are you? I would never. Yes. Tyron barked out a laugh, still trying to curry favor with the master. Vic, you should know by now he doesn't care for this stuff. He slapped a hand against the envelope which surely contained an invitation. If you want his favor, then work harder. Enchantments are all that man cares about. It was worth a shot. Vic shrugged, a sly smile on his face. Although, I must admit, I didn't think he would accept in the first place. When he did agree, I certainly never imagined he would withdraw at the last second. So, to try and stave off embarrassment, I am forced to lure the master's favorite apprentice in his stead. Who is going to be at this thing? Why, an esteemed gathering of rising young entrepreneurs, along with a cadre of Lady Shan's close friends and allies amongst her peers. The apprentice waggled his brows suggestively. A chance to rub elbows with the nobles is worth its weight in gold. You may thank me now. Tyron just stared at him, disbelief plastered on his face. You invited Master Willem to a gathering of young aristocrats. Victor's smile slipped. Well, perhaps I didn't think it all the way through. Never mind. The details are on the invitation. Make sure you aren't late or early. He began to collect himself and head to the door before Tyron could object. Make sure you wear something worthy of the event. Don't embarrass me. Look dashing, but reserved, Arcane. I'm sure they'll be thrilled to meet someone the old goat actually approved of. Wait a second, Vic. Oh, and don't forget your +1. Everyone is expected to bring a partner, except me. I'm escorting Lady Shan for the evening. Victor radiated concentrated, smug energy as he stepped out of the store, his guard shadowing him closely. See you tomorrow, my friend. And with a cheery wave, he was gone into the night, leaving Tyron standing on his own doorstep, filled with weary frustration. Well, shit. Stop fussing, you're scolded him. I hate these stupid robes. Who could possibly have worn something this unwieldy? This is a type of formal robe that was popular in my mistress's realm several thousand years ago, and you just had one on hand. You should be grateful, not bothering me with this nattering. Now sit still. The carriage continued to roll smoothly along the road as the vampire reached across and settled the complex layers in an esoteric pattern that eventually materialized into an elegant formation. She sat back with a look of satisfaction on her pale features. Yor herself was dressed flawlessly in a flowing gown, scarlet of course, her hair bound in intricate curls, and flowed down the nape of her neck. A picture of deadly perfection. This was a bad idea, Tyron groaned, not for the first time. Nonsense. To decline this invitation would be suspicious. Craftsmen of your status would murder their families for the chance to forge ties with the nobility. Not to mention, inviting me has more than made up for your recent dependence on us. I expect the ledger to be squared. Tyron glared. You promised knowledge. I would have it supplied. The vampire smiled, blood-red lips peeling back to reveal her fangs. No need to be so forceful. You will have it, along with these. She reached down to the carriage seat beside her and lifted an ornate, palm-sized box. She undid the latch and lifted the lid, presenting the contents to Tyron. Inside nestled 5 gem-like ovals gleaming with red light, each the size of a fingernail. The necromancer frowned, but reached to take the case regardless. 5 at once. That is unusually generous, he remarked. Should I be worried about your intentions tonight? Calm yourself. I will behave. Indeed, I do not need to do much other than present myself. She arched an elegant brow. The young lords and ladies will come running to me for a deeper taste. She was probably right. Sculpted by blood magic, she was a picture of perfection, beautiful to the point of fantasy. Even Tyron found it difficult to take his eyes away from her at times, and he knew full well what she was. It's almost depressing how effective a weapon appearance can be, he said. She laughed throatily, and he suppressed the stirring of his blood. For some reason, his recent experience made it even more difficult for him to remain calm in her presence. No time like the present, he muttered, mainly to distract himself, and withdrew the case again, removing one capsule and placing it in his mouth. With a sharp crack, he bit down, releasing the gleaming fluid contained within. The moment he swallowed, he felt the burning in his veins and hissed against the pain. Soon, it withdrew, leaving an echo of fire that continued to flow just below his skin. When he recovered, he fumbled for the capsule he had brought for the night and slotted it into the now open groove in the case. Yor watched the process through hooded eyes, a slight smile twisting her lips. Invitation, the guard spoke gruffly as he extended an armored hand. With what little grace he could muster, Tyron withdrew the envelope from his sleeve and presented it. The document was inspected carefully by eye before a crystal was waved over it, then inspected again. Finally, the guard nodded his approval. Welcome, Mr. Armsfield, and guest. Before you enter, a mandatory status check is required. I thank you for your cooperation. Not a problem, he remarked, stepping forward and presenting his right hand palm up. With care, the guard accepted a silver needle from another behind him and pricked Tyron. Then yaw on the pad of their middle finger. The two of them were presented with a page of creamy paper, and he almost rolled his eyes at the waste before he caught himself. The two of them enacted the ritual, waiting as their blood flowed over the page, forming the words and numbers that made up their status. These pages were again inspected carefully, then subjected to arcane inspection via the crystal, before the guard nodded. Welcome to the Shan estate, Mr. Armsfield, Miss Kiris. The guard stepped back from the carriage, and as he did so, the other dozen stepped back with him, lowering their weapons as the gates slid open to allow them passage inside. Kiris, he asked as he pushed down the nervousness he felt. It's a word from my native tongue, she mused. I've been feeling nostalgic lately. I'm guessing it means blood. She turned to him slowly. Why would you think that? Because, at the end of the day, that's all you care or think about. The vampire sniffed daintily. A small price to pay for immortality. Are you sure you aren't tempted? Eternal life has many benefits. I'm fine, thank you, he replied dryly. When they alighted from the carriage, it was difficult for Tyron not to grimace. The structure before them was an abomination, an exercise in opulence. Fountains hovered overhead, drizzling water down into verdant gardens of exotic flowers as paintings formed of bent light glittered on either side of the path. The residence itself was enormous, a towering edifice of radiant, golden stone and colored crystal, studded with glowing orbs, that ensured no part of it would ever be hidden in shadow. For one family to command this much space, inside the castle district no less. Tyron did his best to ignore the gigantic fortress that loomed to his right, dominating the skyline. The weight of it felt as if it pressed down on him every time he caught a glimpse in the corner of his eye. Lucas. There you are. Victor stepped from a small gathering outside the ballroom door, waving. Rather than his normal apprentice robes, he was dressed in an impeccable suit, his long, dark hair pulled back and tied in a neat tail that trailed down between his shoulders. You're looking very dignified there, friend, and I see you managed to find a holy shit. I'm sorry. Tyron frowned. His friend gaped like a fish for a moment before he recovered himself with a strangled cough. Cheeks flushed, Victor appeared to struggle to tear his eyes away from Yor, with a mighty effort. I see you found a date, he managed to grind out. Fucking vampires. This is so pitifully easy for them, Tyron thought, not for the first time. This is a friend and business associate of mine, Yorin Kiris. This is my friend and an apprentice of Master Willem, Victor Tarkin. A pleasure, she said before dipping into a flawless curtsy. As she dipped, Victor's eyes flicked to her bosom and appeared arrested there. Tyron decided to step in and save him, placing himself between the vampire and the apprentice. You may want to ensure your eyes stay glued to Lady Shan tonight, Vic, he murmured quietly in his friend's ear. This is a big opportunity for you, right? Victor closed his eyes and nodded slowly. You're right, I apologize. He resolutely turned his back on Yor and marched away, though he walked a little stiffly. I'll see you inside, he called over his shoulder. They're opening the ballroom in 5 minutes. Tyron waved back before he eyed the various small gatherings scattered around the garden. Murmured conversations and laughter filled the air. Dim forms drifted amongst the shadows, arm in arm with heads bent together in conversation. I hate this. An arm slipped around his own, and he found Yor at his side, watching the knots of people like a wolf eyeing sheep. What did you say to your friend? She asked pointedly. Nothing. Just try not to entangle him. He's accompanying the host tonight, and if he goes mooning after you, he'll probably be found dead in the morning. Yor rolled her eyes. I know who he is. I know who all of these people are. She licked her lips slowly. There's more interesting prey here than your little friend, of that, I can assure you. Tyron rolled his shoulders uncomfortably. Well, try to exercise some restraint, he said. Not for me, she grinned like a beast. For you. Did you know that Lady Jana Shan's older brother will be in attendance? The young Lord Regis Shan is a trainee magister. Isn't that interesting? Tyron stiffened. Yes. Yes, it is. Chapter 127. The inside of the ballroom was an even more opulent display of wealth. Floating chandeliers drifted overhead, made of concentric rings, each rotating a different direction and speed than the one before. Enchanted gems hovered around these lights, sending glittering beams of fractured light around the room that rippled off crystal pillars, creating patterns that played across the fountains that poured down the walls and ran into a stream beneath their feet. Birds formed of mist swooped and coasted high overhead amongst the beams that supported the vaulted ceiling, which was itself concealed behind a magical cloud. Guards in ornate armor lined the walls and manned every entrance and exit, their decorated, gleaming weapons no less effective for the ostentation. Each one would be at least level 40, the rank of a silver slayer, and capable of slicing Tyron in half with a single blow. Around the outside of the room, long tables groaned with food, meats, cakes, pies of all kinds and varieties, each one more over-decorated than the last. When he spotted the 6-tiered cake that dominated the central table at the head of the ballroom, covered top to bottom in a perfectly realistic image of who he presumed was Lady Shan, he almost groaned at the absurdity of it all. Then the cake winked at him. "What's wrong?" Yor hissed under her breath. They enchanted the cake decoration, he managed to choke out, sounding strangled. She flicked her eyes to the object in question, then back to him in a second. Such a simple thing, she sniffed. "I don't see why you're so upset." He wanted to launch into a detailed explanation of the amount of time and effort that would go into such a pointless waste. But then he remembered who he was talking to. "I suppose this is all rather ho-hum compared to the soirees they throw at the court." He sighed. The vampire's eyes gleamed with hunger. "I attended Lord Virek's ball 20 years ago. We arrived at his castle by gondola, traversing a canal filled with fresh blood." Tyron frowned. Wouldn't the blood clot?" She looked at him as if he were an idiot. He rolled his eyes and nodded. "Blood magic, right? Still seems like a stupid waste. You were boating on your own food. What's the human equivalent? Sailing a lake of gravy. What's the point?" Despite his misgivings, he knew the point. This was all a display, a show of wealth and power designed to impress on the guests the strength of House Shan. As he took in the scene and the many attendees, drifting from conversation to conversation, laughing and gossiping amongst each other, he felt strongly just how much he disliked it. Much as his parents had, not once or twice, but many times had Magnan Steelum impressed on his son just how much he detested gatherings such as these. "Waste of my time," he would groan. "Being locked in a bright, shiny cage with a bunch of puffy birds is still being locked in a cage. You wouldn't believe how much we were able to charge them to attend these things." He shook his head, shaggy black hair swaying around his face. "Your mother liked the food, but eventually I had to say I was done with it. I'd rather eat your mother's cooking off the campfire. Though don't tell her I said that." "Wipe that expression off your face." Yor discreetly jabbed him in the side with a sharp elbow. "You either look bored out of mind or as if you want to murder these people. Neither is a good look to have. Master yourself." With a grunt, Tyron mastered his expression and forced the memories and the emotion they carried away. "I apologize. I'll be focused from this point forward." "See that you are. This is an opportunity that you may not see again. Networking is the entire point behind these events. Though youthful indulgence and play is also encouraged." She flicked her eyes toward an amorous couple in the shadows at the back of the ballroom, being a little more friendly than was strictly appropriate. No doubt the Shans were elated to have an opportunity to meet with the premier enchanter in the city. "But when he couldn't attend, your invitation was vetted, of that I'm certain. You wouldn't be here unless someone wanted to meet you." "Well," he shrugged his shoulders, feeling awkward in his many layered robes. "What do we do?" Yor rolled her eyes. "We talk to people. You aren't so socially inept as this. I know you aren't. Do your best to appear wise beyond your years. The robes should help with that, and try to smell like money." "Smell like money?" "Yes, but not current money, future money." "That makes a lot of sense." "Hush. Now lead me around the ballroom. I need to be seen." "Fine." Doing his best to mask his emotions, Tyron allowed Yor to take him by the arm and led her to a small group talking near the center of the ballroom. Unsure what to expect, he was surprised to see that most weren't as young as he suspected. but likely closer to himself in age. They easily made way and allowed the new pair to join their circle, bringing them into the conversation with ease. Master Armsfield, a pleasure to meet such an accomplished young craftsman, a dashing gentleman, extended a calloused hand, a swordsman perhaps. The pleasure is mine, Tyron replied. And who is this charming young lady accompanying you? The swordsman said, eyes sliding toward Jor, a warm smile on his face. Of course. This is a business associate and friend, Yorin Kiris, owner and operator of the Red Pavilion. Oh, I have heard a lot about this establishment, a young aristocratic lady tittered. Most of it good, I hope. Yor purred. Oh, the lady blushed. Yes. It has become very popular amongst the slayers. I would love to cultivate a more genteel clientele, but it is so difficult to provide services that will suit every customer. The slayers like their entertainment rough, which is not suited to a more elegant customer. Further blushes and abashed glances fluttered around the group, and Tyron felt as if Yor's work was already done for the evening. Just like that, they had been hooked. The swordsman looked like he was about to offer to duel Tyron there, and then for the privilege of keeping her company for the evening. With what grace he could muster, Tyron excused them from the group and moved to the next. In this manner, they drifted from one group to another. He tactfully avoided bringing Yor to the group Lady Shan was in, lest Victor let his control slip in front of the hostess. Pleasantries were exchanged, people inquired as to how prosperous his business was, and the health of Master Willem, to which he managed courteous replies. His guest didn't speak much, she didn't need to, but he was grateful she was able to show a little more restraint as the evening wore on. Over there, Yor nudged him in the side. That's young Magister Shan. In the group by the ice sculpture. Which one? The swan. Not the sculpture. Which person? The one in the red robes. She rolled her eyes. You don't see the family resemblance. They're in the shadows. I can't see in the dark. Poor mortal. Attempting to appear casual, he began to shift them in that direction, but found his work was done for him, when another young gentleman noticed him and exclaimed, Master Armsfield, I was hoping to speak to you tonight, if you have a moment. Yor shot him a significant look, and Tyron schooled his features as he stepped into the circle of conversation. Lucas Armsfield, at your service. He performed a short bow and introduced his associate, who drew all eyes for a moment. Yes, as I was saying, I'd hoped to have a moment to chat with you, but where are my manners? I am Lord Amos Grayling. It's a privilege to meet someone as young and accomplished as you. Amos, who is this commoner? Magister Shan spoke with a barely concealed sneer. Is this who you requested we invite? Amos Grayling appeared to be slightly older than Tyron, perhaps 25, tall, with blonde hair and an easygoing smile on his face. He turned to Regis without missing a beat. Of course. As you know, the commoner, Master Willem, the most respected and successful arcanist in the province, was expected to attend, and I'm certain you hadn't objected to his presence. Of course not. Regis rolled his eyes. Well now, are you also aware of just how many of his many apprentices have received his personal endorsement over the years? No. He spoke the word curtly, but there was a hint of interest in the trainee magister's eyes now. 2 Amos grinned. Just 2. The first was Dash, Anita Halfshard. Right. And the second is this young man in front of you. Impressive, no. Of course I had to meet him. With the objections dealt with, Amos turned back to Tyron with a flourish. You may or may not be aware, but your senior apprentice, Anita, exclusively does commission work for the noble houses, so we are all familiar with her incredible skills. Tyron bowed once again. It's an honor to be mentioned alongside such luminaries as Master Willem and Master Halfshard. I still have a long road before I can compare my abilities to theirs. Is it true that your primary class is an arcanist? Amos asked, leaning in, eyes wide. A little confused, Tyron nodded. That's right. I took it up as a secondary. Fascinating. What do you say, Regis? Are you impressed now? It appeared as if he may indeed be a little intrigued. At least his sneer had dissipated as he examined Tyron head to toe with an evaluating gaze. For his part, the necromancer tried to keep his eyes on Amos. Standing this close to a magister was a gust of oxygen onto the ever-burning embers of rage in his chest. Internally, he fought to contain it as he carried on the conversation. Unfortunately, unlike my master and Master Halfshard, I have directed my expertise in other areas, so it's unlikely I'll be able to service the great houses in the same manner. I've heard something of this, Amos noted, green eyes twinkling. You opened your shop in Shaytown, of all places. Quite the scandal. Tyron frowned. Is it really? Master Willem was more than willing to attend the opening and place his plaque on the store. That was the scandal. Imagine that old fussbot stumbling around outside the walls. The poor thing. Amos chuckled and shook his head as Regis contributed a question. You mentioned you focused on other areas. What has been the focus of your craft? Conduit magic, Tyron answered immediately. These two would have no interest at all in his advances in efficiency and what he was capable of achieving with low-grade cores. It was unlikely they'd even seen a low grade in their lives. In the field of networking, arrays and conduits, Master Willem declared I was his equal. I'm not sure I believe him, but I can certainly state my ability in this area as exceptional. His equal, Regis muttered. As I said, Tyron smiled. I personally don't think it's true, but his praise is welcome. It had cost a huge chunk of the wealth his parents had left for him to purchase his apprenticeship with Master Willem, but it had been worth every gold piece. With a reputation like that, you would easily find work for the Slayers or the noble houses, Amos noted. So, why would you open a store outside the walls? So I can practice necromancy in my basement without people prying. He couldn't very well say that. To increase any craft in level requires not only improvements in understanding and technique, but also volume. Outside of the city, I sell largely cheaper wares and do small commissions, but the flow of work is constant and large. I see. Attempting to raise your skills as quickly as possible. I should expect no less from someone who completed their apprenticeship in half the time. Amos' grayling was full of praise. I hope you aren't so busy that you aren't willing to take on any additional work. It was likely that Tyron had only been invited for this moment. The lordling had wanted to evaluate him in person to see if he was worthy. I am, of course, more than happy to entertain commissions from the noble houses, if they deem me worthy. He turned to Regis. As a commoner, of course, I am in no position to discriminate between the great houses. Should the Shan family have a desire for my expertise, I would be more than happy to provide it. Or the Magisters. Wonderful. Amos grinned. It just so happens I have a little something I've been working on. Nothing grand, but if you would be available, I'd love for you to take a look over it as a consultant of sorts. Naturally, you will be compensated generously. It would be my pleasure. Tyron bowed once more, not even having to fake the smile on his face. If he could impress at this commission, he could expect others. Regis had personally heard him accept the task, and would likely hear of his performance. All he needed was a foot in the door. Chapter 128. Tyron should have spent the rest of the week grinding and polishing his enchanting skills, brushing up on his knowledge of conduits, and ensuring he was in peak condition to work with Amos Grayling. Ties to the noble houses were worth a great deal to him in ways that had nothing to do with finances. Access to the corridors of power, a chance to interact with the Magisters, to plant seeds and extract information. He was in no position to take advantage of anything he may learn right now, but later, he may well be capable of anything. Instead, he had inevitably been drawn to his experiments, no matter how he had tried to resist. Fascinating, he breathed as he continued to examine the contaminated silver lining around one particular skeleton. The discovery that some remains transmitted more death magic than others had been made with his first batch of dead, but already that kernel of new knowledge had been expanded. The variation between the skeletons on the cold stone slabs in the study was as much as 20%, but one particular set of remains was an outlier of extreme proportions. Laid carefully around the skeleton, the strip of silver was charred black on both sides, a residual sign of the death-aligned energy that had passed from this skeleton to those on either side. In fact, the silver was so degraded, the sacket no longer functioned. For whatever reason, this one set of bones generated and transferred death energy at a rate 10 times higher than his current working average. What could the reason be? Class, working conditions, something to do with the remains specifically. He had begged for more information about the corpses he was given, and Folletta had been able to provide him with a little. It was better than nothing, but not by much. Likely the providers of his materials were unwilling to provide anything that might lead him to track down their sources, either because he could incriminate them, or make a deal directly with wherever they looted these corpses. No matter the cause, this particular skeleton was valuable, and he intended to keep it. He would need to separate the bones when he stored them to ensure they didn't form a wild undead, something that was inevitable, given the amount of energy accumulated within the remains. In fact, because of this one skeleton, all of the remains were approaching saturation far faster than they should. It was a snowball effect. The skeletons beside this one received more energy, which meant they made more energy, and then passed it to those alongside them, and so on. The bones furthest from his outlier were the least saturated, but they were still well ahead of schedule. Perhaps some remains simply have an affinity for death energy, he muttered to himself. A predilection, and perhaps it isn't determined by how they lived, or even how they died, but simply an inborn trait. A theory, one he didn't have evidence for. Tyron sighed and put his notes down. He had so many questions about the fundamental nature of necromancy, and almost no answers. Someone, somewhere, had surely solved these riddles already, but he had no knowledge of them, and no capacity to ask around. Once more, his thoughts turned to Ahanan the Black, reviled and feared necromancer who had amassed an entire army of undead servants, and led them against the Empire. If some repository of that man's knowledge still existed, it was a pipe dream. If it existed at all, if he could locate it, if he could access it, and if the work survived in any condition to remain useful, only then could he possibly learn something. Far too many ifs. Were he to devote his energy to such an investigation, he would probably waste so much time his own research would have yielded results by the time he discovered anything. It was frustrating and slow, but pursuing his own avenues of inquiry was the best way. He had time on his side, years if need be, to master his craft. There wasn't much time until he was needed at the Grayling estate, however. Shit. He cursed when he realized just how little time was remaining. He rushed to seal away his precious specimen in 4 separate containers, ensuring it couldn't rise on its own before he ran upstairs, changed clothes and washed himself. After he fumbled and cursed with a second set of those accursed robes Yor had lent him, he managed to somewhat arrange them properly, before he rushed out of the store and signaled a carriage to take him into the city. In the privacy of the coach, he reinforced his glamour and took another of the vampire-made blood pills, grimacing as the substance within raced like fire through his veins. An incredible creation only possible through their mastery of blood to manipulate whatever magic was contained within. A mandatory status check was performed at the gate to the noble quarter, and again before he was allowed access to the Grayling estate. Just as ostentatious and obscene as what he had seen at the ball, the Graylings had clearly spared no expense in the construction of their familial abode. Yet it wasn't into any of the towering structures that Tyron was directed. Instead, his coach pulled up towards the rear of the estate, outside a much more humble, though still well-built, workshop pushed up against the rear boundary wall. The sound of hammers ringing on steel, the smell of forge fire and the tang of alchemical compounds filled the air. Amos said he had been working on a little something. The man himself, along with 4 guards and an immaculately presented maidservant, stood waiting for Tyron to alight from his coach, and he did so with what grace he could whilst battling his damnable robes. Master Armsfield the noble scion smiled and spread his hands wide. Welcome to the Grayling estate. Thank you for taking up my invitation. As decorum demanded, Tyron bowed at the waist before replying. I have to admit, Lord Grayling, I am most curious to see what you've been working on in this facility. Nothing so grand as what you are imagining, the young man chuckled. Most of the workers inside are busy with projects for the family, maintaining the equipment our guards use, that sort of thing. No, my little project is being worked on in that room there. He indicated a door on the far end of the workshop, and indicated for Tyron to follow. They walked together along with the entourage of guards as Amos expounded upon his project. This is a little something I commissioned to celebrate reaching level 40, a suit of armor. The best of the best materials were used to forge it right here in the family workshop, he declared proudly, then smiled a little wryly. But when it comes to the quality of our arcanists, we can't quite match up, so naturally, I had to bring in some outside help. He pushed open the door and gestured for Tyron to step inside. Within the room, he found a short, rail-thin woman dressed in a loose-fitting shirt and pants scowling at him. This is bullshit, Amos, she growled. The necromancer froze for a moment before he put 2 and 2 together. He stepped forward and extended a hand. Master Half-Shard, an honor to meet you. The diminutive Arcanist flicked her eyes up and down his manifold robes, before dismissing him with a contemptuous wave of a hand, returning her gaze to the Lord. You paid me to come and do the work, so I've been here working for a fucking week. Now you want this barely qualified upstart to check my work. I should throw down my tools and walk out this instant. Now, esteemed master. Nobody is here to check your work. That would be ridiculous. I simply thought this would be a wonderful opportunity for Master Willem's two most favored apprentices to collaborate. You have final say on any decisions, of course. I have final say. Fine. Get rid of him. She pointed at Tyron without looking at him, a stunningly rude gesture. Yet he found it almost refreshing compared to the flowery phrases and circular discussions of the nobles. The man gets what he pays for, he shrugged. I'll take a look and see if I have anything to offer. If not, I'll leave without saying a word. That should satisfy your pride and your client, right? Master Halfshard turned a baleful glare on him for daring to speak, but he brushed past her and into the workshop, already inspecting the armor laid out in pieces on the table. Not unlike a skeleton, he noted. I'll leave you two to get acquainted, Amos Grayling stated before he ducked out the door and closed it behind him. A tactical retreat, given he likely expected Halfshard to explode. Tyron found a glass lying on a bench and picked it up before holding it before his eyes as he leaned down to inspect the armor. Incredibly fine, delicate sigils had been engraved on every piece. Each arcane circle would provide a different magical effect, powered by the cores which were yet to be set in place. Before his senior apprentice blew up at him, he cut her off. Obviously, you're better than me, he said as he continued to pore over the engravings. You have Arcanist as a main class, for starters, and you've been working for what, 15 years longer than me. There's no chance I'm better at enchanting than you. Then why don't you fuck off? Because Lord Grayling is paying me to look at the conduit work on this suit of armor. Anita Halfshard paused for the first time, frowning. The conduits. Exactly. Satisfied with the shin guard he'd been looking at, he moved to the twin piece for the other leg. Since I can never be as good as you or Master Willem, level capped as I am, I chose to focus on certain aspects of enchanting, namely conduits and arrays. In this one area, our master declared I was his equal. She snorted. Bullshit. I'm inclined to agree, but when it comes to this one aspect of enchanting, I'm very good. Better than you, in fact. What? Anita squawked, outraged. Right here, see this. Your sigils aren't aligned properly. This network is leaking 3%. Bullshit. Despite her protestation, the esteemed master snatched the glass from his hand and leaned down to inspect it herself. After a minute of careful examination and muttering, she threw the implement down. There's nothing wrong with it, you charlatan, she declared. Do you have a shifter? I'll prove it to you here and now. Like hell you will, she growled, but nevertheless pointed him to the right side of the room, where the implement he was looking for rested on the side table. Tyron moved with confidence to the table and began to arrange sigils on the shifter. A handy piece of equipment, it let an Arcanist carve sigils into the surface and then power the array using a spare core. Since the slate was regenerative, one could carve in the surface over and over again. Was it as good as attempting to enchant a core directly? No, but as a teaching tool, or for demonstration and experimentation, it had its uses. Luckily, I don't need to copy your enchantment runes, he remarked as he worked, because I have no idea how any of that works. Master Halfshard snorted. But the components you've used to form your networks are off. Look here, this is how you've done it. He took a step back and allowed his senior apprentice to inspect the slate, which she did carefully. Then she compared it to her own work on the armor to ensure he'd copied it accurately. Now let's power this circuit. He placed a nearby core into the shifter, completing the rune network, and lighting it with magical energy. The two of them could both sense the arcane power running through it clearly. If I rearrange the sigils like so, he made some minute adjustments and powered it again. The difference was slight, but it was there, as he knew it would be. Anita could feel it too. The diminutive woman chewed her lip as she stared down at the network on the shifter. Well, fuck, she said. She turned to look at the armor splayed across the table, a look of irritation on her face. I'm going to have to adjust every network on the entire sodding suit. Of course not, Tyron said. I'll do that. You finish working on the big ticket items. As I said, I have absolutely no clue how most of that is working. He wasn't lying. Hugely expensive enchantments to reinforce armor, project shields, add resistance to the elements, and all the other insanely complex things going on inside this one armored suit were way out of his wheelhouse. The fact that Anita had been able to pack so many dense networks onto each and every piece of armor and have them not interfere with each other was almost miraculous. Without a doubt, she was the best arcanist he had ever seen, with the possible exception of Willem himself. Are you handy with appliance? I don't want you ruining any of my work. Handy enough to satisfy a master. Good enough. Without any further discussion, the two grabbed separate sections of armor and moved to the workbenches. With appliance in hand and a glass positioned in front of his face, Tyron set to work. Chapter 129. Hey there, lover. Folletta grinned at him as she sauntered through the sewer, her crew following behind, canvas-wrapped corpses over their shoulders. Tyron sighed. Is it really necessary to let your men know that we slept together? He asked. I share everything with my crew, she boasted. Thieves need to be a tight-knit bunch to operate. Judging by the appraising and somewhat respectful looks he saw on a few of the men's faces, she'd embellished the story quite a bit. He brought a hand up and massaged his right temple. What did you tell them? He asked, almost despite himself. The thief, dressed in her work clothes, form-fitting black cloth and leather boots, smiled suggestively. I praised your stamina, high constitution and pain tolerance. She licked her lips. These pansies were ready to lose their lunch before I was halfway through describing the night. His pain tolerance. What did that have to do with any dash? The necromancer grimaced. You lied to me, didn't you? A look of hurt innocence flashed over Folletta's face. Elton, what a thing to say. Whatever could you mean? You told me that stuff was normal. One of the men froze, putting down a corpse, glanced up at Tyron and shook his head slightly. It's not uncommon for some couples to strike each other, she deflected. And the knives. He ground out. The goon stumbled and almost fell flat on his face, looking up at Tyron with a look of disbelief and admiration. Folletta stepped forward and sank her boot directly into the ruffian's side. I admit I got a little carried away, she said after regaining her balance. In my defense, you seemed to enjoy yourself. He had. The evening had begun normally enough. They'd eaten, had drinks and conversed before Folletta had led him into a back room. At first, she'd been stunned by his utter lack of experience, but had leapt into educating him with unseemly relish. She'd taught him how to kiss first, as good a starting place as any, and things had progressed rapidly from there. In hindsight, he'd clearly let his guard down too much, and let himself be led by the nose. It was deep into the night before she had gotten especially inventive. It was nice, he managed. Folletta pouted at him. Only nice. Fine. More than nice, he rolled his eyes. Well then, if that's the case, you'll hardly want to refuse when I invite you to another intimate get-together. Let's say, tomorrow night. A frown crossed his face. Why? Some of the men let out strangled chuckles before Folletta silenced them with a deadly glare. She turned back to Tyron, an icy glint in her eyes. Why not? She said, each word chopped as if by a guillotine. I've already reached human level 20, he pointed out. It worked just as you suggested it might. Though I'm a little nervous that was all it took to form an emotional connection with you. Ultimately speaking, I got what I wanted out of the arrangement. As for you, he trailed off for a second, before he shrugged and decided to be blunt. If all you're looking for is someone to fuck, then I'm certain you have far better irons in the fire than me. He had no illusions that Folletta was looking for some sort of exclusive relationship. It was likely she was sleeping with a range of people, and he didn't care. It was none of his business. What had transpired between them had been transactional. Folletta stared at him for a moment before she let out a harsh laugh and shook her head. Holy shit, Elton. I thought I managed to unwind you a little, but you're still strung so fucking tight. I'll spell this out a little more clearly for you. As she spoke, she strode forward until she stood right in front of him, glared up with her brown eyes, and jabbed him in the chest with one finger. First of all, I don't have that many irons in the fire, she sniffed. Finding people you trust enough to get naked around is difficult in my line of work. You trust me? He said incredulously. He was the shady as shit bastard who purchased human corpses off her every month. She had to think he was some sort of mad alchemist, healer engaged in black practices, or just straight up suspected him of necromancy. Of course not, she hissed. But you have nothing to gain from my death, whereas every other thief I run with does. That was a good point. Second of all, I'm interested in you. That means I want to spend time with you. You're easy enough to look at, your conversation is educated, well-mannered and humorous, and you don't look down on me for my lifestyle. Who am I to go around critiquing other people's lives? He thought ruefully to himself. There, I can tell the thought had never even occurred to you. Third, the sex was surprisingly good. You learned quickly and were respectful in bed. That's surprisingly hard to find. She prodded him again. Now, did you enjoy spending time in my company or not? He blinked. I'm going to regret this, aren't I? I did, he sighed. Good, she grinned, before she reached up, seized him by the hair, and pulled his mouth down to hers. They separated after several long seconds, and judging by the triumphant gleam in her eye, she knew his heart was pounding in his chest. I'll see you tomorrow, she breathed before she blew him a kiss and turned, sauntering off into the darkness, softly cursing out her men as they went. No knives, he called to her, retreating back, but she pretended not to hear him. Real progress, at last. Tyron stared greedily at the scarlet letters on the page before him, exultation burning in his chest. Corpse appraisal, level 17. Corpse preparation, level 16. He was getting closer. The techniques he was developing to assess the remains he worked on had been deemed worthy of recognition by the unseen. A welcome indication he was on the right track. The main focus of his experiments had been death magic, how it formed and spread between the dead and undead. To unravel that mystery, his tests with the silver strips and the invention of his lens had taken him far. A lesser focus, though no less important, had been his attempts to uncover methods to ascertain the quality of a given skeleton before he worked on it. Bone density, flexibility, damage and wear all needed to be assessed if he was to choose the right skeleton for the right job. Tougher, hardier bones were more suitable for frontline duty, carrying shields and blades, whereas more fragile or flexible material was appropriate for archers. Tyron was a little disappointed his efforts at molding bones into shields and blades hadn't been recognized yet, but he hadn't been able to put in the time required to master the art. Completing the commission for the young Grayling Lord had taken longer than he would have liked, but Anita had insisted on double and triple checking all of his work. His senior apprentice wasn't used to collaborating, and it showed. Still, her ability to weave enchantments together was nothing short of monstrous, and her command of every element in the process doubly so. He eclipsed her in one aspect alone, and even that was close. Once she'd been satisfied and the armor delivered to Amos, who'd been full of praise, Tyron had needed to spend a good deal of time catching up on his work in the store. Then he doubled down to make sure he was ahead of demand once more. His apprentice had looked on the verge of death by the time they were done, to the point he'd been tempted to point the death lens at him to see if there was a response. But the work had been completed before the next delivery of remains from Folletta. Advanced Death Magic, level 16, another jewel in his crown. Despite feeling like he was no closer to truly understanding how this particular form of arcane energy functioned, at least he was able to identify and study certain behaviors it displayed. One more push, maybe two, he muttered to himself. When these three skills reached their current allowed maximums, he could truly resume his necromantic work, creating functioning undead, studying them, working on the other vital aspects of his craft. Despite his progress, there was still so much to do. His work on the Raise Dead spell had been rewarded with progress, but his focus so far had only been on the conduit aspect of the ritual. Creating the undead intelligence and improving the binding of the minion itself were more difficult for him. Hopefully, the vampires or the dust people could help him there. Satisfied with what he saw, he carefully destroyed the status page, leaving not even ashes behind. His butcher work complete, he disposed of the remains in the sewer, confident the rats would do their work, and packed his work away. With all he'd done to improve his craft, another level in Undead Weaver couldn't be far away. He'd have to be careful, but as long as he regularly performed the status ritual, he could be sure not to trigger his next advancement before he was ready. After a wash and a change of clothes, he decided to get some sleep. It was only midday, but he had no pressing work to do, and thought he may as well rest to prepare for a solid week of experimentation. His eyelids were just starting to close when he heard a timid knock at his door. At first he thought he was mistaken. His staff almost never bothered him in his chambers. But when the knock came again, louder this time, he sighed, rolled out of bed and threw on a robe. Seri greeted him at the door, looking hesitant, but also curious. "Good afternoon, Seri," he said. "Is there a problem?" "Ah, Master Armsfield. There's a pretty there's a lady here to see you. She's downstairs, in the shop." Tyron blinked. "You're Folletta." Neither were people he wanted to see here. In the case of the latter, he definitely didn't want her to connect his two false identities. Feeling a little stressed, he closed the door, dressed himself in a hurry, and rushed downstairs. When he arrived, Seri was busy trying to look as if she wasn't paying attention, and even Flynn was conspicuously working close to an open door, setting calls. "Blood and bone, save me from these busybodies." Irritated with his staff, he swept his gaze across the shop floor, and almost staggered when he saw the sun-haired young woman perusing the glass cases. She turned and spotted him, a polite smile appearing on her face as she began to approach. But she froze minutely halfway across the room, her eyes widening. Her stride resumed almost immediately, but he'd seen that pause. Elsbeth recognized him somehow. Chapter 130. Master Armsfield. Elsbeth greeted him, much more warm than she had appeared before. "It's a pleasure to meet you. My name is Elsbeth Renner. I believe you were expecting to see me." He was. That cursed shriveled prick had told him they'd send a liaison to speak with him. If he'd thought about it for a second, he would have known this was coming. "The pleasure is mine," he fumbled, dipping into a slight bow to cover his confusion. More than anything, the way she'd almost instantly seen through his disguise was like a knife in his heart. Was he that transparent? How had she done it? An awkward silence descended as he stood, brain churning, until he suddenly became fiercely conscious of his two gossiping employees, burning a hole in the back of his skull with their eyes. "Ah, please. If it pleases you, could you join me upstairs for some refreshment? We can discuss more privately there." Elsbeth smiled again, a twinkle in her eye as she acquiesced, and he turned to guide her, shooting a glare at Seri and Flynn as he went. Both studiously avoided his gaze. Only when they'd entered his living quarters and he'd activated the magical protections around the door did he turn and demand, "How did you know it was me?" His childhood friend stared at him, open-mouthed, a hint of reproach on her face. "That's the first thing you say to me," she said. "Really? No. Hi Elsbeth, turns out I'm not dead." Or "Hey there, Elsbeth, it's great to see after 4 years. How have you been?" Tyron slapped a hand to his face, and, after a moment, dismissed the glamour that hid his features. "Yes, you're right, I'm sorry. It's just unnerving to have my disguise seen through so easily. I depend on this glamour to keep me alive." She simply stood, tapping her foot on the floor as she leveled a steady gaze at him. He sighed. "Hello, Elsbeth. It's wonderful to see you after 4 long years. I would have reached out to you, to let you know I was alive, but it felt too dangerous. I'm sorry." The priestess nodded slowly before she thrust her arms out to her sides. "Now a hug," she demanded. He rolled his eyes and stepped forward, enfolding her with his arms. To his surprise, she squeezed him tightly, to the point he almost felt his ribs creak. How'd she gotten so strong? When they separated, she brushed a tear from the corner of her eye, and Tyron invited her to sit at his table as he rummaged for some tea and biscuits. When he sat down and sipped his drink, he found himself at a loss for words. Elsbeth looked different. She was still radiant, but that innocent glow that she had always carried with her was subdued. After 4 years of serving such gods, she must have gone through a great deal. "How have you been?" he asked softly. "It's a struggle out there," she said, waving a hand vaguely toward the west. "I've seen just how hard life can be for people, how much they have to struggle just to survive. I learned a lot." Tyron snorted. "If I know you, then you're still doing everything you can to help them." The priestess of the old gods stuck her tongue out at him. "So what if I am?" she said as she laughed and shook her head. "I've always wanted to help people. That's why I wanted to be a priestess in the first place." The necromancer held up his hands. "That's not a criticism. Quite the opposite. I've never met anyone who had as kind a soul as you, Beth. I'm pleased to see that hasn't changed." He hesitated. Are you still able to help, though, considering your patrons? Elsbeth lifted a brow. You think Crone, Raven and Rot don't help people? She took a long sip of her tea and nibbled on an almond biscuit as she thought. In a sense, I suppose they don't. But they can be more supportive than you give them credit for. My teacher told me many times how surprised she was to see how many blessings I've been able to wrangle out of them. Raven especially is getting sick of me. Isn't that dangerous? Tyron was alarmed, but Elsbeth waved away his concerns. I don't think so. Raven bestowed a blessing on me at my advancement, so I don't think they're really that mad. A blessing from the Raven. Is that how you were able to see through my glamour? A gift of sight? His guest looked at him, a slight frown on her face. What? No, you're making it far more complicated than it is. That glamour may hide your features and disguise your voice to a certain extent, but your mannerisms, the way you stand, the way you hold yourself, all of that stays the same. I've known you since we were kids. It was easy to recognize you. He stared at her. Seriously, you spotted me by my mannerisms so quickly. You thought I was dead. I never believed you were dead even before Orton tried to convince me you'd survived, Elsbeth snorted. And yes, if Worthy had walked into this place, he'd have recognized you just as quickly. The thought of his uncle wandering into the store caused Tyron a painful pang in his chest. Well, that's a problem, he muttered. Is it? There's less than a handful of people who know you well enough to do what I did. Don't be too paranoid. How is he? Worthy. And Aunt Meg. Elsbeth looked at him, sadness brimming in her eyes. Not great, she said. The loss of his family hit him hard. He and Meg are still operating the inn, but it's not like it was. He could see she wanted to say more, but she feared it would be too painful for him to learn anything else. So now that you're here, we'll have plenty of time to catch up. I'd love to hear more about your journey over the last 4 years. But first, I'd be grateful if we could discuss more serious issues for a moment. His old friend hesitated before she sighed and nodded. Fine. Do you have any questions? I assume you're the intermediary the Venerable said would be sent my way. That's right. Since you won't talk to them yourself, I'll be around to pass along their words. They don't exactly make themselves easy to trust, he grunted. They don't care if you trust them, Elsbeth rolled her eyes. They're gods. Don't think of them like people. They were never mortal. You've taken on certain obligations and you have to fulfill them. That's all there is to it. It hadn't been an easy decision to advance his anathema subclass the way he had, but he'd known he couldn't afford to throw any possible source of power away, given what he was up against. That didn't mean he was willing to forget what the gods had almost done to him and to Elsbeth, but he could look past it, if they dealt with him more fairly in future. Well, you're here. Tell me, what is it that the three want from me? Build them an altar, kill some priests, defile some temples. What? No. Elsbeth wrinkled her nose in disgust. Why would they want you to go around murdering priests? Generally speaking, they don't care to interfere with the Church of the Five, and us followers don't want to draw attention to ourselves and get burned at the stake, so we avoid them as much as we can. So what then? What do they want me to do? Nothing much. They want you to kill the 5 divines. Elsbeth took another sip of her tea, watching him over the rim of the cup. He stared back at her open-mouthed. After a few long seconds, he closed it. As in today, he said finally. Obviously not, she retorted. But ultimately, that's what they want you to do. It's only taken 5,000 years. But the three seem to have finally decided enough is enough. They want to reclaim the spark of divinity they gave away. This was good news, since that's what Tyron wanted as well. With the help of the old gods, he might even have a chance of succeeding. Although there had to be a catch, or 5. Is there a particular reason they want me to do this? Can't they just do it themselves? Elsbeth shrugged. Can't, or won't, I don't know. I'm not even certain if they want you to kill the divines directly yourself, or just help create the circumstances that lead to the outcome they desire. The only way to learn more would be to ask them yourself, though they probably wouldn't elaborate. Probably not, Tyron agreed sourly. He thought for a moment. What do they want me to do in the short term? If all they had in mind for me was to help with some grand design far into the future, there's no reason to send you here now. Of course there's more, Elsbeth agreed. She hesitated before she continued. Have you gone out much since your parents died, to the keeps, or anywhere else in the province? He shook his head. I basically locked myself to an Arcanist bench for 3 years straight, he confessed. Since I completed my apprenticeship, I haven't traveled that far from the city. People are pissed. It was weird to hear her swear. Pissed? He asked. Really pissed? When Magnan and Beery died, most of the Slayers didn't believe the explanation they were given. Instead, they blamed the Magisters. Dove had told him that might happen before his family had perished. Slayers hated the Magisters on principle. It didn't take much for them to assign blame to the hated mages. I think they kind of expected it. The Magisters, I mean. They were out and about the first year, making themselves known, making an example of any infractions they uncovered. She shivered. They were brutal. The things they can do with those marks anyway. I believe they expected things to die down after that, but it didn't. Things only got worse. Tyron was confused. What are you telling me, Elsbeth? What's going on out there? There's a rebellion brewing, she told him. In all of the keeps, but especially the most remote ones. Slayers are renouncing their vows. Many are turning from the worship of the Five, and they're banding together. The old gods are trying to harness this momentum. They've been gathering followers, trying to create a locus of power, far from the Magister's reach. Was there any place in the Empire that they couldn't reach? Where? Cragwhistle. This is the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you for your supportive comments. Have a wonderful rest of the day. The Silent Rupt is out.